Good evening. I'd like to call it August 2nd, 2021, Wilson School Board meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Here. Mrs. Casper? Here. Dr. Kennedy? Here. Mrs. Cocker?
Here.
Mr. Martin?
Here.
Mr. McCray? Mr. Negrini?
Here.
Mr. Schneider?
Here.
Mr. Hart?
Here.
8 present, 1 absent.
Please stand for the pledge of the flag. Okay, Ms. Maravich, we do have public participation on agenda items.
Two others.
Okay, can you give those, Mrs. Cocker?
Rules of public participation at school board meetings pursuant to the Sunshine Law, Robert's Rules, and board policy. The following are rules of public participation. Individuals attending this meeting are expected to conduct themselves in a responsible and respectful manner that does not disrupt the meeting. Public comment is not question and answer, but instead is an opportunity to offer comments on matters that are or may come before the board. All comments must be directed to the board as a body and not to any individuals. Clapping, calling out, or cheering is not permitted, nor are conversations in the audience permitted. Individuals may not approach the board tables at any time. Individuals shall speak from the podium. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. Any person making any threats of any type, personal, offensive, or important remarks, or any person becoming unruly may be removed from the meeting or may be cited by local police. The above expectations are outlined in the board policy on 903, which is inside board docs on the district's website.
Thank you, Ms. Maravich, for reminding us of the protocol for how our community is expected to conduct themselves during the board meetings. I'd like to specifically address our attendees this evening and ask that we utilize this meeting as an opportunity to show mutual respect to one another. As a board, we have patiently listened to all of your comments, thoughts, ideas, and suggestions. We have given you our full attention, not interrupted you, and we considered your perspectives. We're asking that you give us the same respect. I'm asking that you, during the meeting, audience members, please allow the board members to express their thoughts and ideas without interruption. Yelling out, taunting, name-calling, cheering, or other displays of disrespect will not be tolerated. If these actions occur during the meeting, I will stop the meeting and you'll be asked to leave. Wilson School District has a long history of excellence. As elected board members of the district, we are proud to serve our community, students, and staff. Please conduct yourself in a manner that reflects the ideals of the Wilson community: mutual respect, kindness, and understanding. Thank you. Dr.
Raise my hand when you have 1 minute.
Okay, sounds good. Wilson School Board. I am the parent of a Wilson student, and I am here to comment on the proposed educational equity policy. The proposal broadly states the policy is to prioritize the principle of educational equity, evaluate policies and protocols to ensure they advance equity, embed equity practices through the district's educational system, review curriculum offerings to ensure materials are selected with consideration for cultural representation, and to actively recruit and promote candidates who are committed to educational equity. This is Wilson turning away from policies aimed at individual equality and towards an anti-American, equity-focused system that will invite critical race theory, known as CRT. I am determined that my child will be educated in an environment where his success is a function of his innate ability, family and teacher support, and most importantly, his work ethic, and not race or abstract pseudo-educational concepts like CRT, which don't belong in K through 12 classrooms. I am prepared to explore educational options outside of the district if a shift is made away from equality of opportunity and toward equity, and if factors such as race are used as an input in determining outcomes. I ask that in the near term, the board drafts and approves a resolution to ban CRT and associated principles, including educational equity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Allie Geiger.
evening, everyone. My name is Alicia Geiger. I am here again on masks because, of course, the CDC has changed their guidelines, and I hear there's going to be another vote tonight. But, of course, it's still just a recommendation. Unfortunately, the unelected health bureaucrats that have exercised so much power in the last year and a half have not learned much. Inexplicably and without any scientific evidence, they continue to insist that children must wear masks when in the classroom. The WHO has told us that it's rare for those without symptoms to pass SARS-CoV-2 to others. Even Fauci says asymptomatic spread is not a common driver of infection. The CDC's own data shows if you are less than 20 years old, you have a 99.997% survival rate. To put this number in perspective, a young child has a higher risk of dying from seasonal influenza than from COVID-19. Yet, we have never required the masking of children during influenza season. The CDC also just came out and stated that the PCR test is faulty and can't differentiate between SARS-CoV-2 and influenza, and that these tests are to be stopped being used by December for alternate tests which will differentiate. I guess that answers the question, where'd the flu go? It was just misdiagnosed for the past 18 months. Harvard and Stanford professors state that more people were dying from COVID months ago than they are today, and you might state the rise in cases, but the cases today are either asymptomatic or very mild with symptoms. As a virus winds down, it gets more virulent but has less lethality, and that is what you're seeing right now. This is common scientific knowledge. Case in point, St. Joe's, as of Friday, had only 2 COVID patients, and Reading, I assume, has none because they completely turned off their reporting system that was online. So I ask, where is the data that you all are basing your masking recommendations on? Our local numbers don't support you. The CDC's cited data just got blown out of the water as unscientific and peer-reviewed as unsubstantial. They said not to worry, though, they'll come up with something. I'm tired of playing this game with you all. Not only do you not have the right to mask anyone, there's no science behind it. The masking of children is about power and control. If the bureaucrats can keep parents and children in fear for their lives, they can also call the shots on anything else involving schools, from types of instruction to funding to member benefits. As promised, I've put my money where my mouth is, and I hope you're ready to do the same. I have a meeting with my attorney in 2 weeks, and anyone that votes for requiring masks will be hearing from us if that requirement is passed. So I'd get your attorneys on retainer sooner rather than later, because again, I'm done playing this game with y'all.
Jared Plummer.
Good evening, members of the board. Thank you for having me up here. I wanted to give a thank you to the board for approving the masks optional policy for the coming year, although judging from the agenda tonight, perhaps that is a little premature. I hope that I am wrong in that statement. I really do. I greatly appreciate knowing that our children will not have to suffer through another year masked up in the classroom. I must now ask you all to have the courage to move forward with this and stay this course, and not allow yourself to be swayed by the vagaries of the CDC, which at this point has now flip-flopped more than a live salmon tossed onto hot tarmac at the height of the summer. We can give our children a far better year this year, one where they're not stuck suffering behind masks. The power to do that lies in your hands. I ask you tonight that you exercise that power very wisely. Thank you.
Craig Stonaha.
All right, hello everyone. First, I want to express how proud and appreciative my family is to each of you and the amazing job you did last meeting on the mask issue. You all did a great job. You made it clear that your desire is to stand with the parents and to empower them to make decisions that are best for their kids. So kudos to each of you, and thank you. I really mean that. We also got to see the results of the district-wide survey that was performed during the last meeting, which was overwhelming, and it's showing that parents, kids, and faculty want the freedom to choose how they handle masking. Which is why I was shocked today when I heard that masks are back on the agenda. I understand that this is a fluid situation. The key facts have kind of remained the same. I mean, parents are still the ones who should be making healthcare decisions for their children, especially when it comes to issues as divisive as this. Number 2, children are still at an extraordinarily low risk of experiencing a COVID infection with complications. 3, parents, staff, and administrators have all had the opportunity to receive the vaccine, which means that the long-term protections that we were shooting for all of last year are in place. 4, virtually every independent study over the past 16 months have determined that paper or standard cloth masks have essentially zero effect in a long-term exposure situation. Not talking 10 or 15 minutes at a supermarket, but 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That is the very definition of a long-term exposure situation. And then 6, not to beat a dead horse, but the Wilson survey was pretty clear in the community's opinions. The issue has kind of been decided. The parents have spoken, the teachers have spoken, and most importantly, you guys have spoken. And I'm proud of how you guys fell last meeting. With the exception of a small minority, we have achieved consensus on a very difficult issue. So let's take the win on masks and let's move on. Also, on the topic of equity, I've read the revised version that's on the website, and I appreciate you guys updating that. I noted that's been stripped down quite a bit, but there are still some issues that are very concerning. While some of the verbiage has been cleaned up, it still lacks limitations. Those guardrails I talked about 2 weeks ago are not there. Thank you. This thing is far from ready to be passed. And until the parents have had an opportunity to give input and feedback, as Dr. Faley had promised, which I also appreciate, it would be inappropriate for this vote to even happen tonight. Please postpone the equity vote until we get a say. Thank you so much.
Alyssa Dunkelberger.
So I would like to address two things tonight, the masks and CRT. First of all, I would hope that you guys would stick with your decision as...
Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt you.
Board policy is that you have to provide us notice before you're going to record. That's in the board policy that complies with the statute. You cannot record during the meeting unless you provided 4 days' notice. That's in the policy. Otherwise, you have to leave.
Are you sure you want to enforce that?
I'm fine enforcing it. I'm fine in enforcing it.
That's not what you, so you're saying that supersedes the Sunshine Act?
The Sunshine Act specifically says you can provide regulations as how it's applied. The policy that's right there, it's the same policy we talk about for Sunshine, specifically says you have to give 4 days' notice.
So June meeting, you didn't fill me, or you said I couldn't. Then July, you sit there in silence, and then in August, you come back and try and stop me again. And you're trying to tell me, I know what the Sunshine Act says. It says,
And I know what our policy says, and I know what the regulation says, and I know what the statute says. So, if
you just want to keep doubling down on
tripling down, buddy.
All right, buddy.
Tripling down.
All right, got you on the record.
So please turn it off. Thank you. Sorry. I'll
Thank
start
you.
you back over. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Sorry about the interruption.
My name is Alyssa Dunkelberger. I would like to address two things, CRT and mask. I would like to hope that you guys will stick with your decision that you came to last board meeting regarding the masks. As I spoke last meeting about the difficulties that personal difficulties my child had with the masks, I was contacted by the school the next day. And while I appreciate that, I really hope that this is not something that's repeated next year so that we don't have to go through continued lessening what he needs in the classroom and making him leave the classroom. And he gets what he needs. As far as CET, I'm completely opposed to it, and I'm asking you for complete transparency. I'm requesting that you publicly release all curriculum for all subjects and all grade levels, and that they be available prior to the beginning of the 2021 school year. Thank you.
Okay, Gwen Hill.
Good evening. I have 4 young children, and my day job is to talk about Medicare all day long. So this is a night out for me. I'm like, woo, I'm out. I bring up my job only because I advocate all day long for senior citizens. It's important because they're a very vulnerable group, almost as vulnerable as our children. My family and I are very proud to be a part of Wilson. My daughter, I have my third child, my daughter is going into kindergarten, and she calls it Bulldog School. And I think that's like the sweetest, cutest thing. But anyway, I'm here tonight because I've had such tunnel vision with my job with the senior population that I didn't realize that my kids, their friends, their classmates needed advocation. I just thought Wilson had their best interests in mind. And sadly, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Hiding CRT by calling it equity or referring to teachers to preach the whole child is dishonest. Saying it's not yet in the curriculum is also untrue, because it is, and it has been for about a year. The indoctrination of our children is not okay. CRT isn't a theory at all. It is a perspective of teaching history. It is racist and an attempt to revive a failed Marxist agenda. Do you really want to divide our beautiful children into two categories of oppressed and oppressors? The key word here is being children. Children who love to love and don't know hate until it's taught to them. Teaching children they can't succeed due to the color of their skin is wrong. Teaching children they've done something wrong, something terrible due to the color of their skin is also wrong. And the last time I checked, 2 wrongs do not make a right. Equality should be our goal here. And I truly mean ours. I mean yours, mine, and ours. CRT isn't about equality, nor is it about civil rights, freedom, let alone justice for all. It is not about a better life for racial minorities. The real intent of CRT is to divide us with clear Marxist intentions. It tears down American institutions, destroys nuclear families, abolishes gender, and the objective truth. Parents, our silence on this matter only shows consent. I too was asleep at the proverbial wheel because I thought Wilson's curriculum had our children's best interests at heart. This ends now. This is our time to wake up, show up, and let the board know it will not be tolerated. Thank you.
Lisa Marie Sonaha.
On Tuesday, July 27th, the CDC advised masks for K-12 regardless of vaccination status. Advised. On Wednesday, the very next day, the CDC also stated that this would most likely be lifted in about 2 weeks. They also stated the advisement is mainly for where infections are on the rise. Based on 5 different tracking maps, COVID tracking maps that I checked today, including the CDC's, neither the state of Pennsylvania nor Berks County is considered one of those high infection areas. In addition, on Wednesday, July 28th, Governor Tom Wolf announced that he would not enforce a statewide mask mandate and will not be requiring masks in schools. So why is this on the agenda? Why are we here? Pennsylvania is not a high infection area. The survey sent out to parents, staff, faculty, and students overwhelmingly came back and said, keep the choice in the parent's hand, not the board. So again, I ask, why are we talking about this? Is it because the board doesn't believe that the parents will do the right thing? Is it that you believe we're not capable of deciding what's best for our own families? Or is it because some of the board members didn't get their way last time? And is this our new process? That every meeting, we're going to continue to hash it out until we get our way? The real issue here is while we're discussing masks and fighting over masks, we have a genuine issue facing our school's integrity and learning. We are being told meeting after meeting that CRT, equity, politics, it's not in our school. However, we consistently see our administration reassure our teachers that the programs that they started last year that are based on CRT theories are going to continue. And don't worry, don't listen to the meetings, don't listen to the naysayers, we're going to continue to do this. We are also seeing funds being distributed, our funds being distributed to organizations that have ties to Black Lives Matter. And we're also seeing bulletin boards like this pop up in our schools that continue to divide our students and bring politics into school. So why are we arguing yet again about masks when there are more important issues to deal with? Masks are simple. Y'all voted on it last time. They're optional. As parents, we will do what's best for our kids. The decision needs to stay in our hands, not you. We do not need nor want the board to tell us how to maintain the health and well-being of our kids. What we need this board is to focus on how to improve every child's education, continue and keep politics out of our schools, and figure out how to educate the future generation so that they are productive and active members of our society. That's what we need. Thank you.
Tammy Keener.
Good evening. I want to thank you all for having me to speak again. I would like to thank you for the mask vote last meeting. It was greatly appreciated, and that's what we need to do. And I've listened to many of the parents, and I believe that they're all happy about that. I do want to correct myself from a meeting on June 7th, where I stated that school teachers in the district sitting on the board, you may not be school teachers in the district now. You were previously, or whatever, but you are now voting on, every time a contract comes up, you're voting on your own benefits. And in my opinion, that's a conflict of interest. SEL, social emotional learning, CRT, critical race theory, equity, intersectionality, comprehensive sex education, CSE, welcoming classrooms, gender identity, changing values and beliefs and mindsets are all words that is under the umbrella of critical race theory. If these are being taught in our classroom, we should all be concerned. This will divide our children versus uniting them based on their color of their skin. I'm also not only here for these reasons, but I also want to express my dissatisfaction with the thought of spending $35 million on a project that will affect all residents in the district, not to mention the future of our children. With inflation the way it is not the time to do this. And according to the Heritage Foundation, enrollment has declined in the last 7 years due to homeschooling and Christian schooling. People are getting smart and pulling their children out of the public school. With this being said, thank you for your time.
Jess Royer.
Good evening, Board. My name is Jess Royer. I'm a father in this district. I have several young children who are just starting to come up through the years now. And I've been following the issue of equity that's being discussed all over the country, especially locally here in Berks County, and you hear a lot of misinformation about it. Professionally, I'm a librarian. I think it's really important that we take a look at where the information is coming from, who is publishing it, and what their motivations are. And a lot of the people who are driving the narrative at the national level and in media formats that equity equals critical race theory are relying on people not looking into that misinformation. And I thank you as a board for thinking critically about this issue. And I want to touch on some things that you hear time and time again. Some of the words that are foundational to this country are that all men are created equal. Those words are written by a slaveholder. We can only take those words so far. If we're really going to apply them, we need to understand that they come from a flawed premise and from somebody who wasn't thinking critically about what they themselves said. We hear about indentured servants coming to this country and making their way through up into the ranks of the middle class or a wealthier situation. Indentured servitude is not the same as slavery. The effects of slavery have lasted a lot longer and been far more involuntary than indentured servitude. Critical race theory is what oftentimes opponents of equity policies call it. Critical race theory is a graduate level course. It's not being taught in educational school, in K through 12 educational settings. I think you as a board are fully aware of the fact that the label of critical race theory is being used to cast aspersions against what is otherwise a theory or a policy put in place to try and raise as many people's efforts towards working to better themselves as possible. Equity and diversity awareness is not about vilifying people who look like just about every single one of us in this room. It's about welcoming anyone into our community who wants to be here. Equity and diversity awareness is an objective understanding that some barriers exist only for certain people. No problem can be solved without first identifying it, and no meaningful progress can be made without hard work and uncomfortable conversations. Recognizing and working to combat white supremacy and its legacy doesn't mean that your life has been easy. It means that you want to remove one particular barrier that exists for others in the world. We hear that the issues being discussed tonight and all over the country are dividing us, but what this is really conversations about things that have already caused divisions among our society. Institutional and systemic issues that affect certain groups of people more than others. And I thank the board for looking critically at this issue and working through a very uncomfortable process to try and remove those barriers. Thank you.
Tony D. Garamo.
Wasn't sure I was on the agenda, but I'm here exclusively to discuss the equity policy that we're looking at implementing. And equity typically, I associate it with CRT, and I think CRT people take a totalitarian view of the thing, that's the only way to solve the problem is through the teaching of CRT, and there's not another way to do it. It's an ideology that says racism is everywhere, and they critically look for it everywhere until they find it, and they always find it, and even when it's not even there. There's racism in everything we do. CRT is self-racist and sexist because it divides us into camps against each other as oppressors and victims based on their race or their gender, being black or a woman. There's a woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, founding critical race theorist, that says that CRT is a belief that the history of white supremacy in our country has resulted in laws and systems that even science continues with that same past, and even science. They reject even science. Racism, they say, is systemic in our society and runs so deep that it cannot be repaired, but we have to dismantle it and replace it. But what it fails to do is recognize that the progress has been made, the time and money and blood it was spent in erasing the situation and erasing racism. CRT believers are completely against the common sense idea that race becomes less socially relevant and racism less, is therefore diminished by not focusing on race all the time and in everything you do. So what's the prescription for a policy for Wilson? Well, it's certainly not an activist indoctrination that fixates solely on past failures, race and gender, whether Thomas Jefferson had a slave or not. That was a different time. Now we're now. Certainly not formed from policies that promote ideologies meant to divide us. Certainly not using racism to fix racism. School programs should emphasize the shared civic virtues that bring us together as a society, like we learned in civics class in 6th grade. Race should be considered as the least important aspect of another person, and not the main aspect that divides you into a camp and puts you on one side or the other. Hard work and rational thinking are things to be valued. Build on the traditional belief that America was founded not to promote racism, as CRT says. It was created in 1619, and our country wasn't started in 1776. Okay, but it was founded to guarantee sacred liberties and opportunities to its citizens. I can bet you that the Chinese are not dividing their people with CRT or in any other way trying to unify in a program they go in. Okay, I urge the school district to adopt a policy against CRT and similar.
Jeff Janakavo.
May I ask a point of order question before my time starts? Pursuant as to the video recording that's typically done, because I notice it's changed, it seems. The control desk was normally back there. Are we still recording this meeting live to the public on YouTube? Yes. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. I'm sorry?
The live streaming is always happening here.
Okay, I just was aware of it.
Yeah, I'm just letting you know that nothing
Okay,
changed.
that's all. I mean, all meetings that I've been here, it's been back there, the command center. That's all. That's my question. Okay. I wish to begin tonight by educating the board that my own last name, Janakovo, carries to this day the terrible echoes of a society that thankfully has long since changed, and yet I choose not to walk around like a victim. My great-grandfather emigrated here knowing some English, certainly enough to spell his own last name, and yet we now know that our last name was really Janakavo, not Janakovo. Unfortunately, the people at Ellis Island did what they always did and did what they wanted to do. Yet I don't go around like a victim. I suppose I could choose to remind of this every time I spell my name. It's butchered. Point of order as well, the member had the proper phonetic spelling. Instead, I live the ideals my great-grandfather came here for: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You should also I hold no love for my great-grandfather, as he actually orphaned my grandfather at age 4, along with his 8 other siblings, divorcing my great-grandmother to live as a single man here in America. So when our society and now our school board would assert that white people have an inherent advantage in this nation, I personally had any and all generational birthright orphaned off to an Amish farmer in Quakertown, where my grandfather essentially worked as a child slave till the age of 16 before running away. As we dig into CRT and all of its happy little offshoots, as you would wish us to accept them, equity, whole child, social emotional learning, we are told this is baked in and systemic, and yet I sit here as someone in direct opposition of that system. I'm told inherently this worked in my family's favor, and it did not. So can this board share exactly what has happened in this school district to warrant these policies? I'd love to know. Who's hired the teachers in need of diversity training? Who are the coaches holding back students? Really, where is this all coming from? Is this board unable to make a decision and stick with it? Or is this a board that's simply led around by the collar by the powers that be for the sake of the federal purse, by the CDC, the Department of Education, and the Fed? We demand you to lead and follow the will of the community. We demand to know which laws presently violate students of color's rights. I know of none because there are no such laws. So this leads us to the moral question. Who is actually violating the shifting of the moral argument? The colonists had all kinds of laws against their efforts to live in a new world, and they established our country and the Constitution we live under now. They had the moral right on their side, as did the abolitionists. They fought against every law possible to eliminate slavery. Martin Luther King, the same, to fight for equality. Equality for the fight for the content of character. I contend that equality is on us, and the outcome is on the individual. So who is committing the wrongs in society today? For me, I view it as the establishments, academia, Wall Street, woke corporate America, and the media. When we look at who these people are, they are in fact the most extremist leftists pushing these agendas, and the voting record of them certainly supports that assertion. So I'll challenge this board to answer this community's questions, not on your terms, but on our mutual terms. Open debate on common ground. That's what we ask for.
Rick Crump.
All right, so last week you all told on yourselves. For months we've been trying to get answers on CRT equity, and you've been trying to convince us that you're unable to answer our questions. And by the way, the Sunshine Act does not prohibit you from answering our questions. Your own rules prevent you from answering our questions. Likely your own rules prevent us from video recording you, so you're not looking for mutual respect. 2 weeks ago, we gave you the opportunity to answer our questions on those front steps, and you cowered away, showing us you have no really intention of answering us. You even tried to hide behind the excuse of an August event where you'll answer our questions, but all you did was confirm that you're going to only answer on your own terms and your own time, and you'll do your best to prevent us from getting to the truth. A reasonable crowd wanted reasonable answers to reasonable questions. And other than Mr. Martin, thank you, Mr. Martin, you either walked by in defiance, or you snuck out another set of doors. Really? You don't represent us. You're not looking for mutual respect, as you say. You insult us. So again, I throw down the challenge to the superintendent and the members of this board to an open and public debate with me, and that this board does not represent the parents, the Wilson parents, but you represent Harrisburg and DC, and I want to debate you on that. We can set the date, time, and terms tonight or later on, so long as you come out from behind your facade and face me. And I'm particularly interested in debating Fadley, Kennedy, Cocker, and Casper. And I'm happy to take you all on at the same time. And finally, if you want to see a clear example of the dangers of CRT equity and the indoctrination of our children, we need to look no further than the mindset of one of our own school board members. On January 19th of this year, one of our own board members, speaking of the events of January 6th, made this statement: "I have never before seen more clear images of white privilege and white supremacy in recent history." You can find this in both the video and the meeting minutes on the Wilson website for January 19th meeting. This board member is the product of CRT equity-based indoctrination, and this board member is a leading proponent for indoctrinating our children with it. The fact that she's incapable of seeing that event as a power struggle between two political groups, that she's incapable of seeing that event as a reaction to what many believe was a stolen election, the fact that she's incapable of seeing that event as frustration boiling over with a system that refuses to investigate and adjudicate justice, where no one else could draw an inference to race, she was incapable of seeing anything other than race, only capable of seeing one race as the problem. This is the very textbook definition of a racist mindset, but then again, the textbook is CRT equity, so we shouldn't be surprised. So this unfriendly ghost, Wilson parents say no to the hate and racist indoctrination of their children.
David Whitmer.
Good evening. I'm still David Weimer. And Mr. Maravich, I provided Edna with a written copy of my objection. So
She'll circulate
it. She can share it later. I don't want to take time for it. My topic is to vote to reject equity in CRT. It may not matter what the Wilson School District community thinks, says, or does in any board meeting or public forum on equity policy or its equivalent. Equity policy has infiltrated the district in the spirit of conformance. Regardless of the community's recent objections, the Wilson Board supports the superintendent's quest to integrate equity policy using an equity task force. One may only hope equity policy becomes neutralized by the law of unintended consequences. Recall the failed promises of reducing health care costs in 2010? It delivered the Unaffordable Care Act of the past decade. By chance, perhaps the Wilson Equity Policy of 2021 and its task force will become the flawed inequity policy in the future. But that's not the real issue at hand. Equity policy reeks of a slippery slope, a gateway to reverse racism, divisiveness, socio-political indoctrination, critical race theory known as CRT, and Marxism. Prepare yourselves. Policy always precedes doctrine, and doctrine precedes indoctrination. Do not be surprised if you see the shadow of CRT dogma waiting at the door of the curriculum committee.
1 minute.
You've been forewarned by the superintendent and board's actions without regard for community input before approving an equity policy. It can happen with curriculum as well. With that in mind, one underlying question should gnaw you to action. Does the Wilson School Directors Board support, yes, or reject, no, the introduction of equity or CRT as a curriculum in Wilson K-12 grades? You deserve an answer. And if you do not receive one tonight, alternatively, the board has the power and authority to act on your behalf and interest by the next meeting. Implore them to draft and approve a binding resolution to reject the introduction of equity and critical race theory or any similar concepts in policy, curricula, teachings, lessons, or instructional materials at Wilson School District.
Dwight Wegman.
Dwight Wegman, Lower Heidelberg Township. On July 11th, the Reading Eagle published an article on the front page, and I quote, "Critical Race Theory, Mistaken Identity," with the subtitle, "Hot Topic, Mostly a High Academic Exercise Not for School Kids." This title is very misleading at best. Now I'm going to quote from Chris Rufo in an article published in City Journal on July 15th. Quote, "On June 30th, members of the NEA, the nation's largest teachers union, voted to approve a plan to promote critical race theory in all 50 states. Union delegates representing 3 million public school employees approved funding for 3 separate items related to increasing the implementation of critical race theory in K-12 curricula, promoting critical race theory in 14,000 local school districts, and attacking the opponents of critical race theory, including parent organizations and conservative research centers," unquote. That would mean that they are targeting people like me and the like-minded community members here with me tonight. Now that we've established that CRT is being actively promoted in the K through 12 curriculum throughout our nation, the question is, what is happening here at Wilson? Last meeting, Dr. Fadley stated, quote, "It is important to note that there has been no curriculum adopted and no changes to any courses planned by the Equity Task Force at this point," unquote. My question is, what about the CRT elements that are already part of the curriculum? It doesn't get into the specific lesson plans or day-to-day discussion. It is my belief that many teachers at Wilson do not want to teach CRT. However, what is to stop a teacher from teaching CRT if they want to? Nothing from what I see. And what is to keep CRT from coming through other avenues? Last board meeting, item 12.2 was approved to contract
1 minute.
services with the ASCD for 6 days of training in the whole child concept starting next week, August 11th. Who exactly is getting trained and what specific courses are being taught? This is undefined. However, one of the stated goals of the ASCD contract is, quote, "exploring equitable behavior, policies, strategies, and interventions," unquote. So you are pursuing CRT and equity through the back door of the Whole Child Initiative, and therefore you're using the whole child concept as a cover to teach CRT. You see, this community is not just focused on the equity policy, we are focused on CRT coming through all avenues in our children's education. I call upon this board to put forth a resolution banning all forms of CRT from the Wilson curriculum, just like the Tulpehocken School District did 2 weeks ago. We don't need to wait to discuss the equity policy. Critical race theory is morally bankrupt. We need to do better for our children.
Jody Whitmer.
I say again, CRT is morally bankrupt.
Jody Whitmer.
You will be asked to leave the meeting if you're clapping. We ask you.
Remind the audience that there were some very clear directions given about clapping and interrupting the board meeting. If it occurs again, I'm going to ask that Officer Johnson escort you out of the room.
Excuse me for a second. This is getting a little too far now. The clapping, I've been in many meetings, many board meetings, where the audience was allowed to clap during negotiations, during parents' rights. The clapping doesn't bother me. Interrupting does. We better be uniform in what we do then.
Mr. Martin, let's have the board vote on that, because that was communicated to this board.
I don't really care that it's going to be uniform across the board. Nobody can ever clap in this room again.
Whether or not they want to have interruptions.
It's in the policy, Mike. It's been in the policy.
But we never enforced it before. Why are we enforcing? Clapping doesn't bother anybody.
People generally do not interrupt and clap at
Wait
meetings.
a minute, let's time out for a second.
State championship are you referring to, or something
I'm
like
talking about, wait a minute, please. I've been in many board meetings where, especially during negotiations, when somebody from the union came up, everybody started applauding them. If we're going to do this, it's going to be uniform every meeting. Nobody can clap anywhere, anytime, any place. If that's what we want, I'm fine with that. But it's going to be uniform, okay? So I want the same things implemented tonight, going forward forever. We just can't pick and choose when we want to turn it on and off, that's all.
Thank you.
I didn't start your clock, so.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm here to talk about CRT, also referred to as equity policy, in hopes of Wilson's curriculum not turning into reading, writing, arithmetic, and racism. To prevent that, I'm asking the board to stand up to voting anything in that would support CRT. It's also important for the board to fully understand the material brought before them for voting. Concerning was just 2 weeks ago here when ASCD was voted on and passed without discussion. Just by looking on their website, it is equity focused with talking about the whole child and equity, essentially part of CRT. Also, last time, Ms. Casper spoke positive about social emotional learning, which is also an umbrella term under CRT. Looking back on the school board minutes, this time last year in August, a whole year ago, the Wilson Equity Task Force gave their first report. Under that, they stated, "We are a task force filled with teachers and learners around issues of social justice and equity." Why is social justice and equity being brought into our district? The government has paid money to the school to have an equity committee. Are you easily bought? Will you protect our children from indoctrination? Please follow other schools' leads like Tupelhocken, who has totally shot down any teachings that fall under CRT. They issued a public statement about doing so just at the end of July. Let's stick to ABCs, not CRT.
Good evening. I am a mom, and I'm here to speak in favor of the proposed equity policy. Equity is quickly becoming another dirty word in education because opponents believe it is just a veiled attempt to divide, label, and blame our children. I'm not sure how we arrived at such an extreme and misleading notion of a word that literally means fairness. So let us instead talk about the real ways that an equity policy could play out in our schools. As proposed in the policy, the district could look at their hiring procedures to ensure the diversity of staff and teachers mirrors the diversity of our students. In Pennsylvania, only 5.6% of teachers are people of color, and we know that if a low-income Black student has just one Black teacher in elementary school, he's 29% less likely to drop out of school. Another outcome may be that the district examines its curriculum to find that the authors, artists, and scholars taught do not reflect the diversity of the students. Recent years have shown growth in the number of books being published with characters of color, but have we made sure our libraries and classrooms have these books so that all students can see themselves and others reflected in the curriculum? These are a couple examples of really simple steps that aim to protect the basic rights of all students. If we continue to propagate this narrow and extremist viewpoint of what equity means, we are missing all the good that can come from this policy. I know there are people at home right now who agree with me. If we are silent, we are letting the loudest voices dictate how our children are educated and jeopardizing the rights of the most vulnerable children in our community. Thank you for your time.
That's all, President Hart.
That's all. Okay, Dr. Fadley.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. I have a statement that I would like to share this evening with the board and the community to establish some focus and direction on what is happening in the Wilson School District. The Wilson School District defines responsive teaching, learning, and leadership for all students as when educational policy, practice, interactions, and resources are representative of, constructed by, and responsive to all people so that each individual has access to, meaningfully participates in, and has positive outcomes from high-quality learning experiences, regardless of an individual's characteristics or group memberships. As superintendent of the Wilson School District, I am responsible for recommending educational curriculum to the board that is aligned with the academic standards established and mandated by the State Board of Education. Let me be crystal clear. The Wilson School District administration has not and will not recommend the adoption of a district curriculum that teaches critical race theory. School districts under state and federal educational laws are responsible for ensuring that factors arising from race, ethnicity, gender, class, disability, homelessness, and other circumstances do not limit any student's ability to access and benefit from district programs. The Wilson School District administration is supportive of addressing barriers to opportunities that students may face, such as poverty, trauma, digital inequity, and discrimination. The district administration has developed the following goals, which are included in the district's comprehensive plan. To fully align middle school English language arts, math, and science curriculum that grows all students 10% on the PVAS test for each subject area at the end of 3 years. Implementation of our profile of a Wilson graduate, redefining what it means to be ready in life, career, and college as a reporting tool to the students, parents, and community. Improve enrollment in higher level courses, college prep, honors, advanced placement, dual enrollment for all students, including students with disabilities, English learners, Hispanic, and Black students by 10%. The following superintendent goals have been developed for the 21-22 school year, and I will ask the board at a future meeting to consider those goals, to discuss those goals, and to approve those goals publicly. Identify barriers to participation in educational opportunities, including participation in rigorous coursework, and extracurricular activities, and other engagement opportunities in the school community. Provide solutions to allow access to educational opportunities, curricula, and the supports necessary for all students. Collect data and monitor success indicators such as attendance, truancy, scheduling, participation in curricular courses, discipline records, etc. Recommend, design, and implement interventions and enrichment programs to further personalize education based on the needs of each learner. These are goals that are not politicized. These are goals that are good for all students, regardless of their zip code and regardless of their skin color. And I would encourage that the conversation shift from the national agenda on politics to what's right for the students in Wilson, what's right for Wilson School District students. That's what I would request, Mr. Hart, that the board considers at a future meeting, perhaps August 16th. We can have further discussion on those goals and get back in the right perspective about doing what's right for all students. Thank you.
Thank you. You will be asked to leave the meeting if you don't stop. Dr. Haley, you have an introduction?
Thank you. This time I'd like to ask Dr. Andy Hoffer to come forward to do a short presentation on the amendments that are being proposed this evening to the health and safety plan. And I believe that that information is going to provide some additional clarity to the people who spoke this evening in terms of what the plan is moving forward and how we arrived at this amendment. So Dr. Hoffer.
Thank you, Dr. Fadley. Thank you, board members. So my goal is to continue to provide updates, and you can kind of see the progression of the dates listed there on the first slide of the different revisions and proposals that we've had in our health and safety plan going forward. Just as a review of where we are and what you approved at the last meeting, we made some specific changes to the health and safety plan based on the guidance that we had at the time. And as you recall, at our last meeting, we had received new guidance as of 3 o'clock that afternoon prior to coming to the meeting to share our revised proposal. Just at the end of last week, we received some additional guidance from the Pennsylvania Department of Health, which I will share, and then share some suggested revisions to our health and safety plan as a result of that guidance. So just to refresh your memory, the Pennsylvania Health Alert Network, or PA-HAN, is sort of the action arm of the Department of Health. They're the ones who provide bulletins and specific instructions to healthcare providers and to our school nurses when it comes to how to deal with lots of different situations, not just COVID, but more specifically over the past year and a half, we've been using the PA-HANs that we've published on our website and received from the Department of Health on an ongoing basis to guide our plans and to guide our interventions and mitigation strategies. Again, like I mentioned, on the 30th, we received an updated PA-HON from the Department of Health that gave us some specific guidance about a number of areas, but of greatest concern, they gave us some updated guidance on masking and on contact tracing and quarantining. So I'm going to review that guidance here and then share some suggested revisions to our plan. Just to review the CDC's transmission metrics that are used to determine the level of transmission within an area. If you look at the chart there, low would mean 0 to 9 cases per 100,000 over the last 7 days. Moderate is the 10 to 49. Substantial would be 50 to 99, and over 100 would be considered a high level of transmission according to the CDC's metrics. Berks County is currently in the moderate range. For a number of weeks, we were in the low range, and we've sort of been hovering in that kind of mid-moderate range for the last 2 weeks now. So we're continuing to track that information locally. So in terms of recommendations from PA-HON 583, which is linked there, and we'll provide that for you to read in detail as well, and we'll also provide that on our website. In terms of contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine for close contacts, they have provided some specific direction for the quarantining procedures that we should follow. And I will say, up until this point, we had not received any guidance from the Department of Health about what quarantining might look like going forward. So the reason for the revision is just to consider what we would do in the situation of a positive case or a close contact who is asymptomatic or fully vaccinated, asymptomatic and unvaccinated, and symptomatic regardless of vaccination status. So you'll note that for an asymptomatic person who is fully vaccinated, if there is a known exposure to a positive case, the guidance says that that individual should get tested within 2 to 5 days to determine if they've been infected, but also wear a mask during that time until they've determined whether or not they are in fact infected. But it does not require any type of quarantining for that individual. For an asymptomatic person who is unvaccinated, if there is a known exposure, basically we would be following the same quarantining procedure that we did last year if there was a close contact identified. The only exception, and the real exception that the Department of Health has shared, is that if the individuals who are either close contacts or in the vicinity of a person who is positive, if both people are fully masked at the time, then that person is not considered a close contact and would not need to quarantine. So that's a significant change from last year's policy where, regardless of masking, if there were a close contact identified within that 6 feet for 15 minutes, we were quarantining that individual. So that is a significant change in the recommendations. And then finally, regardless of vaccination status, the recommendation is that if a person becomes symptomatic after being in close contact, that they should engage in the quarantine protocol and get tested to determine if they are in fact infected with COVID. So that's the guidance that just came out on Friday. So we wanted to be able to reflect that in our plan as far as the quarantine protocols that we'll suggest that we're following going into the school year. So on the topic of masking, the recommendation from the PA-HON is to look specifically at the level of, so if you look at the blue column, that's the recommendation which is currently in our plan that was currently adopted in the situation where our county is in low to moderate transmission, and that would remain the same. The change would be if our county were to shift into the substantial or high range of transmission, the recommendation would be to go to universal masking indoors regardless of vaccination status, and that's directly out of the guidance from PA-HON 583, which is linked there as well. So in summary, the recommended revision that you'll be talking about tonight, specific to the contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine section of our plan, is to add that specific language for the quarantine protocols based on symptoms and vaccination status. And then under universal masking, just to add that delineation between the low and moderate and substantial and high levels of local transmission to determine our decision about masking. Any questions?
These are all recommendations, correct?
Correct.
How do you get around HIPAA compliance? I mean, you have to assume, and this is all language that basically puts you right back to masks. I mean, or else you're shutting down an entire classroom.
In terms of the quarantining?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what your question is.
I'm saying that all this language basically puts you right back to masks from day one.
I mean, right now,
So-
things are low, but I mean, in the fall, you get a couple of cases in a classroom, you shut down an entire classroom, shut down an entire school, you're back to masks full time.
Yeah, again, this is the quarantine guidance and the protocols that we're asked to follow. And it's very similar to the quarantine protocols that we followed last year. Yeah.
But people should get vaccinated if they're worried about this, correct?
I mean-
And then you have HIPAA compliance based on, you have different quarantine scenarios based on if you're vaccinated or not. I mean, you have
I'm
to
not sure if
almost
that's a HIPAA
assume-
violation.
What's that?
I don't know that that's a HIPAA
You
violation.
can't ask people if they're vaccinated or not.
Sure we can. We can't share that information with other people. But if a nurse calls a family and says there was a potential exposure, or is your child vaccinated, that'll determine whether or not we quarantine. It's up to the parent to share that information.
Okay, so I guess my point is
It's
this
a
is all
conversation with the
recommendation.
family.
This is all a recommendation at this point?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Mr. Martin.
From day one, I still don't understand the concern. I think some of these people mentioned that the chances of a child under 99.9%, it's not going to impact them. Kids need to be free. Is that me? Kids need to be free from the standpoint visual affects the mouth, it's for sign language. They also need to understand that children need to get sick. Believe it or not, children need germs. That's part of natural evolution. This is not impacting any children. And I know one parent called me and said, well, my son or daughter brings it home, I get sick. Well, then go get the vaccine. Don't impose your belief on the children. The children are not going to be impacted by this significantly. Don't get me wrong, they get sick, but why are we, I mean, where's the logic? I guess common sense isn't prevailing. That's it. I'm done.
I mean, Mr. Martin, my only response would be I'm just sharing the information that was provided in,
Okay, all right.
from the Department of Health, and it's up to you guys to decide how we implement that.
Actually comment on the idea that children are not being affected. Again, we've had this discussion. They are definitely being affected, especially with the Delta variant, which the southern part of our country is now dealing with, and the children's hospitals around the South are experiencing pediatric patients to the level that they have not experienced before through the entire past year and a half with COVID. If you're going to compare the flu with COVID, in 2018, 144 children in our country died from the flu, which in my opinion, that's not something you hear very common, right? You don't hear children dying from the flu. It's not very common. COVID, 355.
Excuse me, Mrs. Cocker.
Yes.
Can the audience please remain quiet and give the respect to Mrs. Cocker who's speaking? Thank you. I
In the
apologize for
past
interrupting.
year, due to COVID, 355 children under the age of 18 have died from COVID. So it's not that it's not affecting children. The children in our school district last year were fully masked the entire time they were in our building. So when children became infected with COVID, usually it was outside of the school district. They came to school masked, and we did not, as a school district, see spread because the children were masked. Now we're dealing with a Delta variant, which is doubly contagious compared to what we were dealing with last year. We have an entire close to 3,000 students, grades K through 6, who are not even eligible to be vaccinated yet. So you're dealing with, if there are parents that want their children vaccinated to protect them, they don't even have that option yet. So you have close to 3,000 students in our district that are going to be sitting there, some masked, some unmasked, based on our policy. If one of those children comes to school and is positive for COVID, the current Delta variant is as contagious as chickenpox. And as a child that was born before chickenpox, as I'm assuming most people, everyone in this room was, before the vaccination existed, yes, we all had chickenpox, and yes, we survived it. But we were also immune from it then. I can't get chickenpox again. I can probably develop shingles, which is not going to be very fun, but I'm not going to get chickenpox again. If a child gets COVID, they can get it again. This is not an immunity. You're not building immunity in the children. It is a virus. It has been mutating into different variants and is doubly contagious than what we were dealing with last year. So we're dealing with a more contagious virus, and we're taking away our protective barriers for these students.
Okay, I do appreciate that, but once again, you mentioned a number of 300 students.
355.
Okay, more suicides taking place now. We don't care about that, though.
Oh, I care about suicide immensely. I had a student of mine commit suicide while I was teaching.
Okay.
It destroys the family and the community around them.
But isn't it a parent's right to decide what to do? Why
Okay.
are we telling parents?
So I agree that it's a parent's right to make certain medical decisions for their child. Let's say I am taking my child to the pool and I don't think they need sunscreen. If my child gets sunburnt, that sunburn is not contagious to everyone in their class. So yes, for certain things, I would say parents absolutely have the right to decide what they do with their children.
Then you have your child wear the mask if you're
Right,
concerned.
but Mr. Martin, not everybody, that's not containing the virus enough. If you're contagious right now, let's say I'm not contagious, but let's say you have COVID right now, and you're asymptomatic, and you sneeze on the desk. I'm wearing a mask. That's not, and I touch the paper, I touch something near you. I'm not protected. If half the class is unmasked, and last year we had on average in every age group, so elementary, middle, high school, and faculty members, 70 people, 70 elementary students, 70 middle school students, 70 high school students, 70 faculty members throughout the school year were positive. We received messages that those individuals were positive for COVID. Take that same number and then amplify it by half the class. So Mr. Case's concern about the school shutting down is real if we have half of our students unmasked.
Okay, but I don't know how, okay, let's just move on because we could debate this for hours and we're not going to.
But the difference is,
I'm not
I don't need to convince you. I am on the side of the CDC. I'm on the side, right. Right, the Center for Disease Control, yes. I am saying the same things that the Center for Disease Control are saying, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and my own personal pediatrician. If there are people in our community and parents that are concerned about this, call your pediatrician. Guess what they're going to tell
They're
you?
going to tell you what the CD says.
They're going to tell you that they are concerned,
Presentation.
right, because they're doctors.
Mr. Hart, can we please recognize Robert's rules, so we don't have this back and forth, that the president recognizes the floor for someone to speak and it's not completely dominated? Not to suggest in any way that these aren't both valid points, but all we're going to have for the next however many minutes is just back and forth between Mrs. Cocker and
All
Mr.
right.
Martin. So
I'm
I would
good.
ask that we go back to recognizing Robert's rules and that you should be asked to speak upon being given the floor.
All right, I'm done. Let's move on.
May I ask a question? I guess, being that these are recommendations, and my concern about schools shutting down is I was just trying to get ahead of that. If you would ignore all the recommendations and you had a child with COVID in a classroom, and you ignored the recommendations at this point, can you keep a classroom open?
I mean, we would essentially need to do contact tracing for that class and identify if there were any close contacts and quarantine those individuals. It would come down to numbers.
And I guess my point is, if that's a recommendation, though, is the contact tracing, do you have to even contact trace at this point? Has there been any new guidance other than recommendations?
This is the new guidance. I mean, this is...
Which is a recommendation. So if we as a board said, we're going to ignore the recommendation, just use the policy as we have today, if you had 2 or 3, I'm trying to see where the rubber hits the road. If you had 2 or 3 children in your classroom that had COVID, what do? You send them home? What does that look like?
So under
Because that's really the conversation at this point, I believe.
I mean, under the revision that the board approved the last time, we would simply follow the same contagious disease procedure that we would for any other contagious disease, which would be to contact the Department of Health to get their guidance on how to handle the specific situation, provide notification, and then it would be up to families at that point to determine if they were quarantining or following next steps, whatever they may be, directly from the Department of Health.
Okay. And the quarantining last year, was that a recommendation or was that a mandate? I mean, that was sort of a mandate from the governor.
We were following, the Department of Health.
Which is not the case anymore, correct? So everything's a recommendation at this point?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would agree with that.
I'm just trying to understand.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
Mr. Hart, if I
Yes.
may, the one other thing that I would point out that's different this year as compared to last year is that we are only given 2 options. We are either in person or students and their families can participate in the Wilson Virtual Academy, which is not the hybrid way of providing education to our students. So under this proposed policy, despite however many potential contact tracing that takes place and a student being unsymptomatic or asymptomatic, they're out of school 7 days over and over again without in-school instruction, without, anything to help, enhance their educational well-being. I think that has to factor into the decision of the board this evening. Certainly if we were in a position where, the online was taking place, I think that would factor in, but, sending kids home for 7 days and here's your work, good luck, I don't think that's in the best interest of students either.
But we, sorry, can I go?
Go ahead,
But
Dr.
we
Kennedy.
could avoid that by instituting the masking for the whole class.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, the guidance indicates that if all parties are fully masked, that no quarantining has to take place, yeah.
Any other questions for Dr. Hoffert?
Yeah, actually, two. There were very specific building closing metrics last year.
Correct.
Based on building size and
Yep.
X number of cases, how many days. Do those exist anymore?
No, as far as I understand, the short-term closure metrics that we were using with the dashboard and everything, none of that is in existence anymore now.
So there would be, unless we decided. to
For a
close-
building shutdown, correct, yeah.
Right,
We would
okay.
have to make that
And
decision.
then to sort of follow up on what Mr. Greeny was saying, is there, I'm assuming then COVID positive or quarantining students, whatever, it would be like a regular sick day, like they would be out and they wouldn't be able to remote into their class or anything, correct?
I don't know that I can answer that question for you. I think, in terms of how we would treat the absence, the guidance still does ask us to have some flexibility with how we're marking absences if students are quarantining. There are situations where, teachers have access to things like Google Classroom and their cameras, but we're certainly not in a position that we're offering remote learning like we did last year.
Right.
So yeah, that would be a different situation.
So we're not offering any remote learning, because there are still, there's emails coming in, there's people that are truly concerned about sending their kids back.
The instructional
We
options.
should have an option at least for them.
Well, the instructional options that we're offering are the in-person learning environment or the WVA, which is the asynchronous virtual learning environment, yeah.
You mentioned a significant difference to the update was that if those who were around the positive case were masked, then they wouldn't inform others.
They wouldn't need to be quarantined.
They would not need to be
Correct,
quarantined.
yeah. According to the exception, I can go back to that slide. So the exception to the quarantine recommendation would be if all parties were fully masked, then no quarantining would need to happen in the case of a positive.
So, and that's different than was last year.
Correct,
So
yeah.
we may
Yeah,
see
and
as-
that's regardless of
Vaccinated.
3 feet, 6 feet physical distancing, yeah, that's what they're saying.
Okay.
One more question.
Thank you.
So when does this end? The next variant comes out, it's never going to end. Amen.
I don't have an answer for you, Mr. Martin.
Mr.
All right, let's move on.
Any other questions for Dr. Hoffert from the board?
Mr. Martin, I'd like to ask Dr. Hoffert to clarify just one point before the board makes their consideration. Can you clarify for the board who has the authority to implement the quarantine? It's the Department of Health when we contact them.
Correct.
Just walk them through the process maybe of how that works through your office, because I think that's an important piece that's missing here. It's not the parent that determines whether or not the student stays home from school. It's the Department of Health.
Correct. So if we're following the contact tracing procedure, we're contacting the Department of Health and reporting a positive case, just like we would for strep or for some other infectious disease. We're reporting that to the Department of Health, providing that contact information, and the way it was supposed to work last year was that the Department of Health would reach out directly to the families and provide them with written guidance on the quarantine procedure, how to follow up with their physician, and other recommendations for mitigating the spread of the disease. And that was supposed to come directly from the Department of Health in an order with, in communication directly with the family. In reality, that ended up being the school districts across the Commonwealth doing all of that work, that contact tracing and that contacting the families. So, operationally, it looked like our school nurses calling and making those decisions and giving out those timelines, but really it's the Department of Health that was providing that guidance and making those decisions about quarantining.
So the plan that we brought before the board is really two-tiered. One in low and moderate transmission where masks are optional. The second being the substantial and high transmission where it becomes a situation where in Berks County, the spread of COVID-19 is more prevalent. And we're saying, based on the PA Department of Health's recommendation, that if we pivot in the substantial and high transmission, if we ever get there, to having all students wear masks in our building, nobody will miss school.
Correct.
Any other questions from the board for Dr.
I have
Hopper?
one more question. Why are we using Berks County? Because Reading, the school district of Reading, is going to skew any results. Why aren't we doing it?
So the Pennsylvania Department of Health and Department of Ed are no longer running their metric dashboard. So the countywide data is the data that we have to determine what level of transmission we're in according to that chart.
So we would penalize Wilson for something that's happening in Reading, possibly? Yes, just say yes.
Mr. Martin.
All right. It's
All right.
just, it's, I know you
I
can't
hear-
answer that
I hear.
question. I know that.
Thank you, Dr.
I-
Hopper.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looking for a motion to approve the Wilson Health and Safety Plan as amended the 2021-2022 school year. Looking for a motion?
Cocker.
Mrs. Cocker first, do you have a second? Dr. Kennedy, any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Case?
No.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
No.
Mr. Negrini?
No.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
No.
Four yes. 4 yes, 4 no.
Doesn't pass, let's move on.
Okay, John.
Doesn't pass.
All right, doesn't pass. Moving on to approval of the minutes for, looking for a motion to approve the minutes of the school board meeting held on July 19th, 2021 as attached.
So moved.
We have a first, Mr. Martin, do we have a second?
Schneider.
Mr. Schneider, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Payment of bills, Mr. Martin.
Yes, Mr. President, I submit for approval tonight payment in the amount of $3,011,378.82.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Negrini, second.
Mr. Negrini, second. Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Abstain.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
That's 7 yes, 1 abstain.
Superintendent's report, Dr. Fadley.
Thank you, President Hart. I present this evening the superintendent's report, which is representative of personnel and program recommendations.
Looking for a motion to approve superintendent items 4.1 through 4.5 as presented.
Casper?
Mrs. Casper first, Mr. Schneider second. Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Dr. Kennedy?
Yes.
Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Under Human Resources, 5.1, request authorization for the superintendent to make employment commitments to qualified applicants for the purpose of filling vacancies that will be, and action will be ratified at the Board of Education at the next official meeting. 5.2, request approval to offer food services a hiring and referral incentive. 5.3, request approval of the elementary virtual academy case manager. 5.4, request approval for the addition of 1 full-time speech and language therapist. 5.5, request approval of the adding of 2 part-time middle school athletic trainers using the attached job description. 5.6, request approval of the revised job description for the elementary grade level leader. 5.7, request approval of the job descriptions for elementary food service manager and general food service workers. 5.8, looking for motion to approve human resource agenda items 5.1 to 5.7 as presented.
Cocker.
Mrs. Cocker first, do you have a second?
Casper?
Mrs. Casper, any discussion?
Yes, Brian. On 5.5, the addition of the 2 part-time trainers, what caused that to come about? What was the explanation for that? I may have missed it, but what's the reason for that?
Thank you, Mr. Martin, for your question. It has to do with our partnership in the past where we have been provided 2 part-time graduate level students who, as part of their program, work for the district. Those individuals are no longer available through that university, and we're in a situation where we need to have coverage for those programs.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question with regard to 5.1. Just with the hiring of the long-term subs that we've been doing for the last year, I've heard that we've been hiring long-term subs with 10 and 20 years experience, when my understanding was we were supposed to be doing that for new teachers. So from a run rate dollars, spend-wise, we're not getting the bang for our buck that we signed up for last year. I'm just trying to seek understanding if this is the case or there's more to it.
Are you talking about the long-term subs that we're utilizing in the building for day-to-day substitutes, or are you talking about?
We hired permanent long-term subs last year to fill gaps for COVID and beyond.
So, Mr. Hahn, can you address that question?
All of our long-term subs start out at B step 1, so they're all the same salary, $52,000. So I'm not sure the information in regards to 10 or 15 years. They may have 10 or 15 years of experience, but all long-term subs in the district, a bachelor step 1, $52,000.
Okay, if that's the case, okay, thank you.
Any other comments? We have a first and a second. Roll call, please.
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy? Yes. Mr. Hart?
Yes.
That's 8 yes, 0 no.
Under Student Services, 6.1, request approval to revise the application for Act 80 days for elementary and secondary schools for the 2020-2021 school year. 6.2, request permission to approve the adoption of the settlement agreement and release directly pay the Hilltop Preparatory School. 6.3, looking for a motion to approve Student Services agenda items 6.1 and 6.2 as presented.
Cocker.
Mrs. Cocker first. Do you have a second?
Casper?
Mrs. Casper, any discussion? Roll call, please.
Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy? Yes. Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Under Operations, 7.1, request permission to renew our annual support service agreement with CM3. 7.2, request permission to renew our annual support services agreement with Glenzoid Incorporated. 7.3, request permission to renew our annual support service agreement with Mainline Commercial Pool. Looking for a motion to approve Operations agenda items 7.1 through 7.3 as presented.
Negrini, so moved.
Mr. Negrini first. Do you have a second?
Schneider, second.
Mr. Schneider second. Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy? Yes. Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Under Finance, 8.1, request approval of the attached Plan Con K materials with regard to the issuance of the bond, issuance of the District's General Obligation Bond, Series B of 2021, and authorize the administration to submit the Plan Con Part K forms and related materials to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. Looking for a motion?
Martin moves.
Mr. Martin first. Do you have a second?
Second Case.
Mr. Case, any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy? Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
9.1, under Transportation, request approval to purchase 2 new propane 25-passenger with Lyft Bluebird Vision school buses from Brightville Transportation. Looking for a motion?
Schneider.
Mr. Schneider first. Do you have a second?
Negrini.
Mr. Negrini, any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mrs. Casper?
Yes.
Dr. Kennedy? Yes. Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
8 yes, 0 no.
Under extracurricular, 10.1, request approval of the updated 2021-2022 admission rates as attached. Looking for a motion?
Cocker?
Mrs. Cocker first, do you have a second?
Martin.
Mr. Martin, any discussion?
I just have a question, why do we charge our own students to enter into our events?
Dr. Bailey, turn it over to you.
The answer to that question is because there are costs associated with paying the officials and the game management crew for those events, and the admission rates help to offset the costs of those particular items.
Don't our students still get charged an activity fee?
They do get charged an activity fee, and those activity fees are used to continue to purchase the equipment and the necessary supplies that help to continue the operations of those particular activities, whether they be extra co-curricular or sports-related band, et cetera.
So
The
this
activities
is
fee
in
is,
addition to
I'm
that.
sorry, go ahead, Mrs. Cocker.
So this is in addition to
This
that?
is in addition to that.
Okay.
That is correct.
My question is, if they pay an activity fee, that's because they're playing a sport or co-curricular?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So not all students will pay an
Not,
activity fee?
not all students pay an activity fee, only those that choose to participate.
Okay, thank you.
We have a first and a second. Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Casper?
No.
Dr. Kennedy? Mrs. Cocker?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Negrini?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Case?
Yes.
Mr. Hart?
Yes.
7 yes, 1 no.
Under policies, I'd like to open up board discussion of policy 832, educational equity. Putting it on the floor for board members to discuss.
I just want to start off with some technical issues with what's being written. First of all, these are all technical comments now. You really can't have a board committee comprised of the public. A board committee can be an advisory board, but only the board can appoint a committee, and only a committee cannot function independently of the board. So what I'm trying to say is, under Pennsylvania code, anything that requires any type of cost or anything has to be approved individually by the board. So some of these things in here need to be adjusted and adapted just for technical purposes. You can't do what this is saying at this point in time. So I just want to put that out front, because board committees have only authority to present something to the full board for approval. I mean, the finance committee can't go out and say, we're going to do this, or any committee. So I think we have to segregate a committee, an advisory committee from a real committee, because I think it's going to get muddled in at some point in time. So I just want to start off with that.
Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Martin, just point of clarification so I'm understanding you. I'm looking at like 1A where it says establish the equity committee. You would call that like the equity advisement committee?
Well, I think we should have an equity committee, but then we should have an advisory committee that reports to the equity committee, because the equity committee then makes the recommendation to the board.
So you're saying like a board equity committee and then a committee, that the one where the students and
Right.
community members.
That should be an
part.
advisory board.
I got it, I understand.
I would almost agree with that. I would think that we would need a little bit more support around the issues of equity, because they are so comprehensive and they cover a vast majority of our, of how we operate. I mean, I don't know where it's headed in its evolution, but I think that's something that we've talked about in terms of looking at equity throughout the district. And other districts do have specific equity positions within their administrations. We do not.
You may.
I feel the need to set the record straight about the formation of the Wilson Equity Task Force. There has been an incredible amount of mis and disinformation out there. In December 2019, Dr. Fadley asked board members, I went too far, to start a new ad hoc committee which she called at the time the Student Services Committee. This came from some conversation we had about how Wilson does an amazing job with students who do school well and with students who have special needs, but can miss those students in the middle who don't necessarily have a disability, but who are not living up to their academic potential. When asking for a chair and a co-chair of this committee, Dr. Fadley told Mrs. Casper that he thought she would be interested and then asked for other volunteers and looked at me. I distinctly remember telling him that if anyone asks that I did not volunteer for this committee because I need another committee like a hole in the head, and that my husband would kill me if I signed on to going to another meeting. But I agreed to be the co-chair of this committee because I own one of those kids who just doesn't do school well. And I felt that he was left to his own devices as one of the kids in the middle. So we went to this committee without a whole lot of parameters, just knowing that there was a certain group of kids in the district that we weren't meeting their needs. The four of us, Mrs. Casper, Dr. Hoffman, and Mrs. Troutman met, and we shared stories and floated ideas. We talked a lot about the social and emotional well-being of our students, school culture, and the economic disparity among our students. We had no budget and no funding, and we remain having no budget and no funding. In our discussions, one common theme seemed to be equity, hence the name change. Mr. Martin attended several of these first meetings and is witness to the evolution of this committee. He can attest that at no point did we have a discussion of critical race theory during the formative meetings. I first began to think about equity versus equality in terms of the equity and equality in our schools. For example, one of our HSAs at one of our elementary schools donated $13,500 toward books as part of our reading program. And another HSA donated over $30,000 towards books at another one of our schools. That didn't seem fair or right to me. And another example that drove me crazy as a teacher was the idea that schools had to be equal. There was a time when all schools, regardless of size, had to have computer labs with just 30 computers. So at Lincoln Park, they had 30 computers with 7 classes in the whole school. While at Whitfield, we had 30 computers with 4 classes per grades K to 6, 28 classes. Kids at Lincoln Park could get to the computer room daily, while my kids at Whitfield were lucky to get in once a week. Ironically, equality ended up being the justification for closing Lincoln Park and West Wyomissing. Sometimes in schools we need equality, and sometimes we need equity. One instance that illustrates this happened my last year in teaching when Mr. Hart was my principal. At Whitfield, we had 28 students in our first grade classes that year, with a larger than normal group of students who would benefit from extra help in reading. Over at Green Valley that year, they had 17 or 18 in a classroom and virtually no students who needed extra help. To be equal, both schools had 2 reading specialists, but both schools did not have the same need. So for the second half of the year, 2 reading specialists from Green Valley came to Whitfield for half a day to work with our struggling readers. That is equity. I find it frustrating that our gerrymandered official, Jim Cox, sought to instill panic by sending a letter full of false information to his constituents.
Please give respect to Dr. Kennedy, please, or you will be asked to leave the building. Yeah, Dr. Kennedy.
I'm sorry, I'm going to say it again. I find it frustrating that our gerrymandered official, Jim Cox, sought to instill panic by sending out a letter full of false information to his constituents without speaking to anyone from the Equity Committee or the school district. There were 6 words of truth in that communication. Critical race theory is a lens, but everything else was factually inaccurate. We did not start this committee to indoctrinate students into critical race theory. First of all, that's not a thing. Second of all, as I explained above, we were asked to start this committee to identify the students who are not reaching their potential and the barriers that they may face here at Wilson. We are looking at ways we can better educate them. Isn't that what we all want? There are students that are not having a positive learning experience at Wilson, and it is our job as a district to address that. As an example, 70% of students who are currently in summer school are from families that qualify for free and reduced lunch. I see that Mr. Kaminskis isn't here, but hopefully he'll be watching this on the computer. At the last boarding, Mr. Kaminskis, who I normally enjoy speaking to, he's the really tall guy who's in the service. He talked to me a lot about Constitution Day. He said something to the effect of, what do we want to do? Put some kid with autism who doesn't speak in an AP class? I know he probably doesn't realize what a terribly hurtful statement that was. As a mom of a nonverbal child with a very heavy-duty special needs, I'm very well aware that my son does not belong in an AP class. I've been changing his diapers and hand-feeding him almost 18 years now. He gets an excellent education that meets his needs where he is here at Wilson. He will never talk, chew, or live independently, but he does make incredible strides each year with our amazing special ed teachers. But the more I thought about that comment, the more I got to thinking about all of the students with special needs that I know. My cousin's youngest child has autism and is mostly nonverbal, but he can count and write words in several different languages. He can solve complex math problems. He's only in elementary school, but yes, maybe one day he should be in an AP class. And maybe with great teachers and therapists, they'll be able to unlock his brain and one day he'll go to college. So yes, maybe we should want to see our nonverbal autistic kids in an AP class. Not all children are the same. I wonder where all the people in this room were who supposedly care so much about our curriculum. Where were you when No Child Left Behind came around? When our students were reduced to only a test score and only taught what was on the test? Where were you when they took spelling and handwriting out of the curriculum? Where were you when Race to the Top mandated we adopt the Common Core standards, which were worse than the PA standards?
By the way, we would like to answer their questions.
No, you need to
Mr.
stop.
Crump, please.
This is my turn.
Mr. Crump, you will be asked to leave the building. Keep up. Please stop.
You know she's not.
Give respect to Dr. Kennedy, or you will be removed finally.
You don't understand the rules of a public forum.
3 minutes.
Mrs. Keener? No.
I ran for this board, unlike you. I had the guts to run.
Ask them to remove both of them.
For the board.
Well, excuse me, you're going to be...
Dr.
I'll wait.
Dr. Fadley?
Ms. Keener,
Mr. Crump?
Mr. Crump, I'm going to ask you politely to leave the room. Thank you.
Just be a record that we do want to answer your questions.
I'm going to put it on the record. I'm glad you
Thank you.
raised 4 wonderful children.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Kennedy, you may continue.
Thank you. Where were you when Race to the Top mandated we adopt the Common Core standards, which were worse than the PA standards? If you really cared about curriculum, if you really cared about students, actual students and actual curriculum, you would have showed up then. Why are you really here? Clearly, your anger has nothing to do with actual students or curriculum and everything to do with a national disinformation campaign. I'm asking everyone who is watching or who will watch this meeting, the actual Wilson community, not just the 30 people who are here today. The next time you hear someone say that Wilson is hiding CRT, or that equity is the same thing as critical race theory, or we're indoctrinating children, or teaching children white people are oppressors, or trying to divide our students, or have a hidden curriculum, I want you to recognize that this is factually inaccurate. It is a lie. It is made up. It is not true. I was in that meeting. I heard it. Mr. Martin heard it. Dr. Hoffert heard it. Our students heard it. I was there. You were not. As a district, we are trying to provide the best we can for all students by removing barriers preventing them from being as successful as they can be.
Thank you.
Mr. Hart.
Mr. Negrini?
Thank you. Now, I think the most challenging thing anytime that there is a debate on issues that people feel passionately about is that oftentimes we talk past one another because we don't fully understand where the other side is coming from. I think there are individuals on this board that feel very passionately about this particular policy and what it means, and there are members of this community that feel very passionately about things that are of grave concern to them and their family. To suggest that anyone that is either sitting on this board or that has come before the board to speak that doesn't care about education and doesn't care about our children's well-being, I think, is misplaced. So that being said, I think it's important that this dialogue is taking place so that we're all on the same page about exactly what it is that we are talking about and what it is that we hope to accomplish. And I don't think we're going to solve that or come to a consensus this evening, but the more we have these discussions and dialogues, I think the better off that we're going to be. It's important to put some things in perspective of where did this come from? Where did this proposed policy come from, and when did this proposed policy come forth? If you recall, back in the summer of 2020, our superintendents in Berks County signed a resolution seeking equitable treatment amongst members of this community, and it was in reaction to the George Floyd incident that moved things in that particular direction. That is the genesis. It wasn't before that anybody was coming forth and saying that school districts here in our community were treating people unfairly. That's where the genesis came from. And so the Pennsylvania School Board Association sent to the Wilson School District and all the other public school districts a proposed equity policy. It didn't come from, individuals, within the Wilson School District. This was a statewide narrative that the administrators here presumably worked on and discussed in some committee section. And this proposed policy came forth in our first reading a couple of meetings ago. It was something that I didn't work on. It wasn't something that many of the board members worked on. But back in the summer of 2020, after that superintendent's resolution was signed, I questioned in a lot of ways how that was taking place here at Wilson. And I had some significant questions about whether or not there were racial inequities here at Wilson, that there was discrimination taking place here at Wilson. And I got a response from an Angela Bailey back August 5th, 2020, that she asked me to share, and I think I did then, and I'll do it now again. As a recent Wilson graduate with honors and a black community member, I would like to offer my opinion on the recent board meeting in regards to the introduction of addressing systemic racism in the classroom. First, I would like to applaud you for stating that you would like to see specific instances of racism. In the 13 years attending Wilson, I never experienced racism by my classmates or teachers. This is not an issue with my generation. I had a diverse group of friends that connected through common interests, not by the color of our skin. While I admit it would have been nice to see teachers that looked like me, I would never change the experience or teachers that I had throughout my Wilson career. I was engaged, encouraged, challenged, and respected by all my teachers. I would like you to know that not every minority believes in systemic racism or buys into the narrative of white privilege. We do, however, believe there is economic privilege and two-parent family privilege. I would like to share with you the reasons why I believe this to be true. My great-grandfather moved from Alabama to Pennsylvania to start his own cement business. My grandfather and his son worked third shift for Stanley Flagg's company. On the weekends and during the summer months, my grandfather would take my dad and uncles to work with my great-grandfather. They were paid with bologna sandwiches, lemonade, and most importantly, the value of a hard day's work. My black father grew up with both parents. He bought his first house at 22 years old. He works for the same company for the past 30 years. In contrast, my mother, who was white, was from a divorce home, had an absent father, was pregnant at 18. She struggled to pay her bills, worked 2 jobs, and was living just above the poverty level. If white privilege and systemic racism exists, wouldn't my white mother have been doing much better than my black father? Thankfully, my parents have been married 28 years. I was privileged to grow up with a 2-parent family. I am quite frankly sick and tired of being labeled as oppressed, especially by people who are not black. In the last few months, I received messages from some of my well-intentioned white friends that my life matters. I was deeply offended. I never thought that my life didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I felt less than and pandered to. Thankfully, I was able to communicate with them about how this made me feel. Many expressed that they thought this is what they were expected to do. Instead of well-meaning white teachers who buy into white privilege teaching diversity in the elementary schools, may I suggest that we look beyond color. Let's, as a district, examine the underlying causes as to why there are different outcomes when offered the same opportunities. Single-parent homes would be a great place to start. I would suggest that a mentor group of high school students volunteer to work with struggling elementary students of all colors. I am grateful for the teachers that challenged, encouraged, and motivated me. I am thankful for the diverse group of lifelong friends that I made. I am proud to say I am a Wilson alumni. Thank you for your time, Mariah Bailey. Now, obviously that is only one part of this continued discussion about whether or not critical race theory is a real aspect of education in today's society. Due respect to the gentleman that spoke earlier, the librarian, and his name at this point escapes me. Yes, back in the 70s, critical race theory was looked at from a legal doctrine standpoint about the legal justice system and the different outcomes in the legal justice system. But that has permeated its way into many other areas of higher learning and discussion. And where race is at the forefront of a number of discussions, and not to say that we shouldn't be having discussions about race-related issues, but it's really, are we looking to change the way we do things currently simply because of different outcomes of different groups? And the concern that parents have here that have spoken about critical race theory and some of its tenets making its way into our classroom. One of the professional learning opportunities that is listed on our website is a course instructed by Professor Richard Milner IV, who's a professor of education at Vanderbilt University. And the course is Becoming a More Equitable Educator, Mindsets and Practices. And concern that I think some may have in terms of what does that really mean. Professor Milner wrote an article in October of 2020, and in that article, he looked at the time during the COVID pandemic, rather than returning to normalcy after the COVID-19 pandemic, to stale, dated, predetermined, irrelevant, under-responsive, disconnected, and, quote, racially neutral curriculum and instructional practices that maintain a white-centric status quo, teachers have a renewed chance instead to address opportunity gaps in education. And it is that language, it is that information that does cause some concern as far as what does that really mean in terms of the curriculum that is being discussed and implemented in classrooms, and specifically classrooms here at Wilson. Professor Milner goes on in that article and talks about when teachers adopt a colorblind mindset to their work, where their curriculum, instructional, relational, and assessment practices do not acknowledge, honor, and build on students' racial identity, they create gaps in opportunity. He goes on further in this article he wrote in 2020, talking how teachers who believe they have rightfully earned their privileges through merit because they have worked hard, followed the law, or have skill and ability often do not recognize how those pathways to privilege are not available to everyone. So I think there are some genuine concerns that are not, constituted out of thin air and this national narrative of, diversity, equity, and inclusion being absent from some of the tenets of critical race theory. And so this is not something that we just simply say we're not doing, or this is a movement of national concern based upon politics or based upon simply skin color. And you don't have to take the word of what appears to be in this room, predominantly white individuals. You can listen to the teachings and the words of many men of color who are academics in this country, well respected. Thomas Sowell. You can listen to the teachings of Glenn Lowry, professor at Brown University, John McWhorter at Columbia, Jason Riley, Shelby Steele. These are legitimate concerns that are being raised by other individuals of color in terms of the blurring of lines between the tenets of critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And I think ultimately, when Dr. Sowell, in his book, A Conflict of Visions, which I would suggest in terms of committees, if we're going to be reading in those committees some of the words of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, that there also be consideration to reading the teachings and the ideas of some more traditionally conservative voices like Thomas Sowell in A Conflict of Visions. There's a lot that can be learned, I think, from hearing different perspectives. I don't think that there are people on I'm going to back up a little bit from there. And again, some of the wording in the proposed policy does have some significant cost to the potential policy. The educational equity audit, Loudoun County, Virginia school system spent over $500,000 on their equity audit. Montgomery County school systems in Maryland spent about $400,000. I think a legitimate question is with this proposed policy, are we looking at those particular costs to be added to our budget? Would that take away opportunities from other students in the name of educational equity? I know I've taken up a lot of time. I'll end with two thoughts. First and foremost, Dr. Thomas Sowell, again, a wealth of knowledge and information, but I'll quote him: "If there is any place in the Guinness Book of World Records for words repeated most often over the most years without one speck of evidence, diversity should be a prime candidate." Is diversity our strength or anybody's strength anywhere in the world? It has not been our diversity, but our ability to overcome the problems inherent in diversity and to act together as Americans that has been our strength. I do think that this continued dialogue will give us an opportunity with some of the ideals and good intentions of some of this proposed policy that would still, in many ways, address the concerns that many people have and will continue to have regarding how much of this proposed policy focuses upon some areas that we can all agree should be addressed on a day-to-day basis, and to what extent the needle is pushed too far that it becomes so diverse and controversial. So my opinion at this point is that, you know, as was stated, whether or not this particular policy then starts becoming a curriculum-based policy. We've seen it in Oregon and California with their proposed equitable math programs. The Department of Education recently, with the safe reopening of school districts, had posted on their website that was taken down, as it was indicated, was put up there by accident. The Abolitionist Teaching Network presents Guide for Racial Justice and Abolitionist Social and Emotional Learning. This was taken down by the Biden administration. So these are real concerns. These are real policies. These are real programs. These are real groups that have become, in some ways, more and more influential in public education. There's no harm in continuing to have that discussion so that, you know, again, we all get back to what we all believe is what's best for our students, and that we actually listen to one another in order to accomplish that goal. So, thank you.
Can I go, Mr. Hart?
Yes.
I'd like to push back on a few things. First of all, you indicated that our start date was after the events of George Floyd, and as I said at the beginning of my statement, this committee started in December 2019.
I didn't say.
Prior to the events.
I didn't say your committee.
I want to be clear
I said the policy.
that, actually that's not true, that we started drafting the policy prior to all that. Talking about, do we need a policy? Do we not need a policy? What would it look like if we had a policy? There was a lot of discussion, and this has been going on, you know, we've been very careful when deciding on what to do with this committee. The other thing I want to point out is the two districts that you spoke about in Maryland and Virginia. In Maryland and Virginia, the entire county is a school district. It's not a small school district like Wilson, so of course the cost would be astronomical for that. And the third thing I want to just note is that, you know, you can cherry pick whatever authors you want to pick. You can cherry pick whatever letter you got from one African American girl. But Black people are not a monolith. They're going to have experiences in a range. They're going to have a range of experiences with racism. And we have to acknowledge that that experience is not the same experience as many of the students that we have spoken to in the Equity Committee. And I sat in the committee and listened to the heartbreaking experiences of our Wilson students. And I'm not disparaging her. I'm happy, I mean, that's amazing, like to go through 13 years of schooling and not have racism. Like, good, great, what a lovely experience. But I'm telling you, there are a lot of students, especially now that racism is out in the open and everybody's okay with it. And the Asian American hate is up. Jewish American hate is up. The crimes are out of control. I'm just saying her experience is not the experience of the students that we spoke to in the Equity Committee.
And again, I would encourage you to go listen to John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, because experiences is not data. Experiences does not necessarily drive decisions, because experiences in many ways are subjective to other areas in which one could point out whether or not those experiences are based in any reality within control of a system, an institution, or not.
I would
Again,
agree
that's-
with that experience, may I, Mr.
Just let Mr. Greeny finish, please.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Mr.
Go ahead.
I would agree with that, experiences don't dictate that. And I see this student's experience as a confirmation that our district is not addressing the intersectionality of race and economic disadvantage. If this student only saw her experience of economic disadvantage without being able to see how race is intertwined with it. And I think if, just to kind of contextualize where we are in this process with equity, I would like to just warn us that the reading that I have been sharing for over a year, the Gorski article that has been driving the work of our equity committee to inform us, this is the #1 detour. It's the first detour. It's called, where do I have it? Pacing for privilege. We are pacing ourselves based on the comfort level of those who have the power to control where this committee goes, rather than thinking about the students who would benefit from this policy. So this is the #1 detour. This is the #1 warning in what's driving the way we run this committee. And I've been sharing with all of you for over a year. So we're playing by the book here in terms of stalling the work that needs to get done in this committee. And I have some stuff to say here as well. Those counties that you mentioned, just so you know, the concept of equity from a systemic perspective, when a school district often, prior to this time period that Mr. Negrini pointed out after George Floyd, when there were lots of state sponsored equity statements being provided, equity was generally something that was happening in a school district because the state has proven that there was discriminatory actions happening. So if there was equity going on, and there was a position for an equity anything, it was because it was found that there was systemic discrimination going on. So I just wanted to clarify that and when it's a mandate, sometimes it's funded, sometimes it's underfunded, sometimes it's not funded. So in terms of the money that we spend, we haven't spent anything. So in my last update for the Equity Task Force, back in June 7th, I reported that as a district, we are committed to passing an equity policy. And although I don't doubt that we still are, I wanted to express my disappointment with the direction that this process has taken and all the delays that we have been experiencing. Much of these delays are getting in the way of doing the real work that needs to get done in our district around equity and providing pathways for marginalized students and staff to access all of the wonderful opportunities that the Wilson District has to offer. I have been teaching some variation of race and ethnic relations at the college level for over 20 years now, and I have never seen the concept of critical race theory be so convoluted, misinterpreted, and politicized. All of this in an effort to further divide our country and position us against each other. To be clear, critical race theory is not a curriculum.
nor is it equity. Critical race theory is not taught in the K-12 level. However, now that you have all drawn so much attention to it, high schoolers have sought more information about it than ever before. And now, critical race theory is no longer as obscure among a much younger demographic today. Critical race theory and many other critical theories like it is a perspective, one of many that are taught generally at the college and advanced degree level. It is a way to view the world, and it helps to challenge our everyday perspectives. This contemporary theory has helped to debunk the ideas that racism is something that is learned in the home, that is completely individual, and now we can seek to more appropriately address racism at various levels throughout our society. Critical race theory has helped to uncover the enormous wealth gap in this country between white and black Americans, where for every $100 that whites own, blacks own only 13. We know this due to our ability to approach this problem from a critical perspective, that this gap is almost entirely caused by the nature in which our social institutions run: housing, education, workplace. And therefore, we have the tangible ability to do all that we can to close such a gap. So why wouldn't we want to try to solve that? If we attempted to close this gap using the methods of equality that many of our public speakers have suggested, and magically every social institution treated everyone equally, it would take 200 years to close the black-white wealth gap in this country. Why should anyone have to wait that long? Herein lies the argument for equity. This is when policies, practices, interactions, and values at all levels and in every social institution are representative of all people and are conducted in a way that provides necessary access and resources to those that need it the most, and distributes all those resources in a fair and just manner. Why is this so challenged? Why do we have to continue to wait for people to agree with that? We know that our Wilson students desire an educational experience that is representative of all students. And this is demonstrated by some of the survey feedback we received from them that I reported back in October of 2020 when students were asked about their experiences with race. These are just some of their quotes. I feel like Wilson does not care about all students because injustice is not talked about. Wilson ignores issues that are happening in the black community. I learn more from TikTok about race than I do from Wilson. I don't see any issues. Everyone is treated the same. These quotes clearly depict that Wilson educational experience around race can be a totally different experience for some than for others. That needs to be addressed. As your elected board representative, I have listened to your grievances, and I appreciate your eagerness to have your voices heard. And for those Wilson students, staff, and community members, however, who have perhaps felt silenced and even more marginalized during this process, I would like to reassure you that we will continue to work toward a more equitable experience. And so you know, this can be an incredibly lonely place up here, especially for leaders of color. So please, I would encourage you to have your voices heard too. As I listen to many of the arguments against Policy 832, I must say that one of the most offensive things that I heard is the idea that somehow our efforts are unpatriotic. None of us up here would be here if we did not take an oath to uphold all core American values and truly believed in our American electoral process. And although I try not to talk about my own personal experiences, but hello, I think I'm probably the only non-white person in this room. None of us would be here. None of us would be here if it wasn't for our belief in our electoral process and in the values of our Constitution. But I am only one person. Although I don't like to talk about my personal experiences because I'm only one person, but as the only person of color in this body of leadership, it is consistently lonely and scary. It is virtually impossible for me not to identify as my gender and my race. So for anyone to tell me that it shouldn't be considered or it shouldn't matter would be like erasing my entire existence, since I think about it all day, every day, and not always because I choose to, but because society demands it. I grew up here in Berks County, going to predominantly white schools. I did everything I thought society wanted me to do. I learned the dominant language while sacrificing my own. I performed with grit and worked a little harder than the average. But it wasn't until graduate school when I finally found that book. It wasn't in the required reading list of any syllabus, and it was tucked away in a dusty, dark corner of the library, written by a white woman. And I was like, Before that, I didn't know what I didn't know. All of a sudden, I kind of knew. This is finally something I can connect with, and my experiences throughout all my education were suddenly transformed, and I could see them through a completely different lens because I was able to critically evaluate them. My educational experience from then on was so amazing. And I love the quest and the constant learning that our educational system is capable of providing. I learned to view education as the most important tool in my life that no one could ever take away from me. Yes, I resented that I didn't get it earlier, but I have it now, and I certainly made up for lost time. Only in America can you have such a vast wealth of information freely at your disposal. Not only that, but only in America can you challenge, debate, and critically evaluate information. I want to make it clear that I don't know about critical race theory and all the other things that I teach about in my race and ethnic relations courses at the college level, just because of who I am, but because of my education. And that's why I'm here. I want all students at Wilson, like me or not like me, to experience that and not to have to wait until graduate school to do so. I now know what I didn't get, and I probably know better than anybody else up here. It is very possible to enjoy your education when you feel connected to it. And why should anyone have to wait for that? I would be happy to participate in any discussion to amend any parts of this policy 832, but the foundational principles to this policy should not be held up any longer, and we owe it to our marginalized communities to integrate this in our district now. Thank you.
Any other comments? Maybe Mr. Snyder?
No, please, go ahead. I guess mine comes from more position of confusion. Like the one speaker earlier, my understanding of equity was simply always just fairness. We have so many equitable things that are in place in schools already, free and reduced lunch programs, access for physically disabled students to move throughout the building, elevators, things like that. Those are all equitable things. No one complains about those. And as I look at the policy itself, race is but one component. Like, all of these are protected classes. So it seems to me, I'm just a simple man, but it seems to me that all this does is really codify something that we're already doing. And it doesn't make sense to me to conflate it with something political, and when I see nothing political in this language. If someone can point it out to me, because race is but one piece, and that's what we keep hearing about, critical race theory, but socioeconomic status, English learner status, these are all things we already deal with, and no one comes and complains about any of them. I mean, would they like, I'm not saying any of you, but I mean, would people like kids who can't afford a lunch to just not eat because that's equal? I don't think anybody would. So I am just confused about what I see versus what I hear. And I don't know if anybody on the board can, inform me.
I can. I mean, there's a lot in here that is so ambiguous, it can lead to unknown pathways.
So for you, it's a matter of clearing up the language, because that's what you said earlier, like you add the advisory
Right,
committee
I mean,
piece and.
We're going to evaluate policies and protocols and ensure that the advanced district grows with diversity. How do you do that? How do you do that? How do you do that?
Well, they said in the previous piece, develop metrics.
Metrics. You know what a metrics is? It's a mathematical formula that provides nothing other than statistics.
That's right, it's a data point. I got it. And so they're going to evaluate whether those data points are met. I mean, that's how I read it.
Well, you can do that qualitatively, not just quantitatively. You can create metrics.
No, and I'm not, what I'm saying is, first of all, in my 20-some years here, I've never had an instance where a parent, and I know several black families, have ever come to me and said their son or daughter was treated inappropriately versus somebody else. So what I'm saying is, we define a solution to a problem I don't understand.
I have had parents in my class come talk to me about the lack of representation in the curriculum. I've had them come...
What does that mean? Lack of representation? I don't even know what that means.
Well, didn't you hear what I just said? I didn't even connect with any of my curriculum in K-12 until at all.
Well,
So
okay.
I don't. I know what I didn't get, and I know that there are aspects of our curriculum that have the same thing.
I can't grab my hands around this.
One person at a time to speak, please.
Because, my grandfather came over on the boat. My name's not Martin, but to fit in, it was Marcadius. So he said, we're going to be Martin so we can fit in. I don't hold that against anybody. I'm moving on. But the thing is, there's so many ambiguities in here. Enlist the support of community experts and stakeholders to assist school leaders in examining their practices? Why do we have to list people from our community to come in and tell us what we should already know? I mean, I want to quantify where we failed. And once we quantify that, I can understand this better. But it's so broad brushed, I have no clue what this is even about.
Well, this is not supposed to be this is not supposed to solve a problem. We don't even know that there's a problem yet. This is supposed to create the framework for which we are to look at our district from this lens to see if there may in fact be a problem. So this is just providing the framework, and that's what we as a board are charged to do. We create policy for the district. We create the framework by which our administration can carry out their duties. And that's what a policy does. And we should be debating this. We should be scrutinizing it. We should be talking about it, amending it, doing all of those things so that it is shaped in a way that will support our administrators to do their job and do it in this manner, equitably.
And I understand that the problem is we got it backwards. We got the cart in front of the horse. Traditionally, the superintendent would make a recommendation and the board would review that and understand it. I understand that things right now are all over the place, and I have no clue where we're going, but the thing is, as written, first of all, you can't adopt this as written because this committee can't do this. It's not under the school code. I mean, I know you said the School Board Association wrote this, which, you know, half the school districts don't even pay any attention to what they say, but I know the problem here is, you know, this has to be written as to what our objectives are. Our objectives are, here's what, I could write this in 30 sentences. Our objective is every student that comes through Wilson should be given the opportunity to obtain a job up to their ability. Whether that's flipping hamburgers, make him the best. Whether it's making a rocket scientist, make him the best. Everybody's gonna be different. You could spend $2 billion on me trying to make me a good basketball player. Not gonna happen. So we gotta have some parameters as what we're trying to accomplish. We can't change. Unfortunately, and Amy, you were saying about, you know, No Child Left Behind. If you were listening to some of my statements years ago, I said we should leave children behind. Unfortunately, not everybody can make Algebra 1, Algebra 2. That's what I think we need to address here. What are our parameters? Does everybody have to go to college? I don't know. But we seem to want to push everybody to college. That, to me, is not equity. Equity is giving every student the ability to obtain the knowledge up to their ability. And this has nothing to do with race. As far as I'm concerned, it has nothing to do with race, and it never has with me. I mean, you know, I don't want to get into the stories, but we'll move that on. But this is just doesn't say anything. It just says blah, 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 but it doesn't quantify anything. You know, it's well-intended. I get it. And I think everybody on this board wants a policy that promotes equity for every individual, but we can't, you know, to be realistic, we have a budget. We have an infinite amount of dollars, and we've already burdened the taxpayers with unbelievable increase. So what I'm saying is, I think we should, you know, do through the committee, we'll, you know, next committee meeting, let's go down, let's write this, and let's talk about each one of these items. Maybe we can resolve them all. I don't know.
I just want to start, I read the article, and I'm very interested in, you know, following this conversation and continuing the debate and the conversation. The one of the issues I have with the perspective of the article is it's sort of the racist, anti-racist. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. There's no middle ground. And then that article was all about you're either going to sign a mental blank check and agree with everything, or you're a problem. So there's no middle ground. I'm willing to meet in the middle and understand things, but I'm going to ask questions, as other people are. If I'm asking questions, it's not that I'm trying to be anti-everything that this policy is about. If I can add, and I asked you about a month or 2 months ago, list 5 or 10 things that you feel are a true issue, almost like you have there's smokers. You create a smoking policy. You have cell phone abusers in a classroom. You have a cell phone policy. What specific things do you want to fix? Let's have some focus groups with metrics, with facts, things that most of this stuff is taken care of through federal and state laws, where with discrimination and such. So what are, to Mike's point, what are we trying to fix? Give us 5 or 10 things that we need to address, and then let's try and figure out a policy or focus group on solving that. You don't need a policy to do the right thing. There are a couple of other things I want to add just with regard to somehow going from now whole child to emotional learning to critical race theory, and how we bridged that gap so quickly. You know, with what concerns me is book banning. What is next? I mean, can we talk about current events in a classroom, about what's going on without, you know, the community saying, well, you're not allowed to talk about that in a classroom? Children need, or students need a voice. I mean, that's part of this. Students need to be able to talk. So if it's after school groups, are we going to shut those down because they want to talk about topics that people may not like? You know, we talk about on the same note, suicides. Kids need to have a voice and talk through their issues that are occurring on this day. Let them have that voice. So with regard to you know, curriculum and such, you know, To Kill a Mockingbird, is that on the table? Based on some of the things I heard tonight or in the past month, would we be teaching To Kill a Mockingbird anymore? You know, Atticus Finch and Boo Radley. I mean, and the perspective of defending that black man with an entire community. Is that off the table now? Because that is sort of, and this was 35 years ago. I mean, we've been teaching that. I mean, so based on some of the things we've heard, does that come off the table? I don't know, just something to think about. So there's also another thing where, with regard to equity and you know, I'm co-chair of the Student Discipline Committee. And I think in the last 4 years we have expelled, or there have been 3 cases that came up, you know, different, you know, there's minorities and white kids, and you know, we have in our minds, we take into consideration, you know, home life, all sorts of upbringing, things of you know, that people are going through, and we consider all of that. We have that in our minds as we go through those things, and you know, and consider those things. So if we were a school that, because someone was constantly late because of their home life, and we kept dinging them and then expelling them because they couldn't make it to school, and we had a very high percentage of that going on in our school, I would say that that would probably not be equitable, and we should probably look into that. But we don't do that here. And I guess what my question would be is, what are we trying to fix? What is broken at Wilson? Give me 5 or 10 things, or this board 5 or 10 things, and let's take a look at them. So that would be the only reason why much of this policy, to Mike's point, is, I don't know where you go with it. It's an open checkbook to, you know, that can go unchecked. I think that was pretty much. So yeah, I would, you know, our hiring practices, our discrimination, discipline, are we doing all those in an equitable manner? And I think we are at the school. I have not heard differently. So let's have focus groups on those things and get some metrics behind that stuff and try and solve those problems. But we're not going to solve everything. I mean, and what can a school solve and what can't we? I mean, there's only so much a school can solve. You can't solve all problems. You know, what is in our purview, so.
So I think a couple of things that different board members have brought up kind of go along with what you're saying, Mr. Case, and what Mr. Martin said as well. So Dr. Kennedy pointed out that our summer school, we have summer school for 2 different reasons. One for credit recovery, because students did not pass the course, and one for credit advancement, because they're trying to complete a course over the summer so they don't have to take it the next school year. In the group that has credit recovery, which means they failed the course, 70% of those students are free and reduced lunch. So right there, that tells me that we have a group of students who are failing our classes, 70% of them are free and reduced lunch. There's one thing, okay? There is something to put on our list. I would like to see in our AP courses, what's the percent of students that are free and reduced lunch? What's the percent of students that are non-Caucasian, okay, non-white students? Compare our IEPs, which is our special education program, to our GIEPs, which is our gifted education program. What are there disparities there? Okay, and those are some things that I think this policy is trying to get to. So not necessarily that they have this list already constructed, but that this is something that as a district we are committing to, that we are going to make sure we do the audit, which is mentioned in the policy, to see where those areas are that we can address. And I think Mr. Negrini's point about the cost associated, which I completely understand taxpayers, that's the number one thing. It shouldn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. Cost and our taxes and providing what's best for our students while still respecting the taxpayers in our community, it should be a balance. So yes, it's going to cost some things, and I have a really good example of one. I have a child that was in a class with a student that required the use of a wheelchair, and they were, I think, first graders at the time. And the first grade class was going to put on their holiday, their winter, not holiday, but winter concert, and the student that used the wheelchair, there was no access to the stage for that student. And so the first grade class decided to write a letter to our director of operations, first to the principal, and then I think it was passed on to the director of operations, to come up with some kind of plan so that this student, in their class had access to be on the stage with all of them, so that the student didn't have to have her wheelchair at the side and kind of participate. And the result of that was they talked to the engineering class in the high school, and they thought maybe they could come up with some project that would be really neat and involve the high school kids and build a ramp. And then they decided that in order to include any student in the district that would have this concern, that it wouldn't just be for that one particular school, the school district, our school district, purchased, and I don't know the cost of it, I'm sure we have that knowledge somewhere, I don't know if Mr. Simcox remembers, but they purchased a movable lift to put the wheelchair onto the lift, raise it up to the stage so the student may join in the performance. That lift now could be moved to any of the schools in our building that requires that, so that every student in that situation has an equitable opportunity to participate in their holiday concert. That is equity. Dr. Kennedy's example of one computer lab per school building, when the school buildings did not have the same number of students, that's equality that didn't work. What we're talking about when we talk about equity is programming and developing things for particular schools based on what they need, not just so that every single all 5 of our elementary schools have exactly the same thing. Because I guarantee if you look at the populations of those elementary schools, they're drastically different, both economically, both racially. And I think it's interesting that the public is very heated, and I know it's a national discussion, but it's been brought into here. And so we need to address it. Very heated on the one issue, the one word in here about race. We're not talking just about students that have racial differences, and because of those differences, they have disparities and barriers to their education. We're talking, yes, about Black and brown students of color. We're talking about our LGBTQ population. We're talking about our students that have physical disabilities. We have an amazing visual impairment program at Wilson. Those students could not get the same education in a different district as they do here. We actually have students coming from other districts to Wilson for that education. We're talking about students that are experiencing poverty or homelessness. You would be amazed at how many students in our district are homeless, and they come to school every day, and you expect them to do the same thing with the same resources as a student that's coming from a home that both parents are working or they have an income to spare. And that inequity exists in our district. We're also talking about students that are English language learners. So that cost money this past year. We hired 3 new teachers for our English language learners because the need is there. We're not just going to say, well, it's not in the budget, or we'll just make the caseloads larger. We have a growing population of students that are coming to school that do not have English as their first language in their home. And for a ton of people in this room, I guarantee that happened in your history, whether it was German, like it was in mine, when my mom's parents still spoke Pennsylvania German to them and refused to speak anything else, or Polish, or I don't know everybody's background, but Italian, I don't know. The point is, children are coming to school with different needs, and this policy is the true intent is to address those different needs so that every student has the success, not just because they come from a good background. Thank you.
Thank you, President Hart. Board members, for I think what I would characterize as a very healthy conversation to get different perspectives out. And I guess my input on this is, so where do we start? Where do we start to come to that consensus? And I would suggest that the 7 goals that I outlined at the beginning in my statement would be a nice place to start that conversation regarding this policy. And I would go back to my statement and say that we have a responsibility as a school board and as a school district administration to ensure that we work on some of these goals, because it is required of us. So I would suggest as a school superintendent that we start at the point where we identify those goals, and I can share those in much with the board to clarify those in the update this week. but perhaps that is the beginning of our conversation on Policy 832 is what is the work going to look like in our organization? And how do we make sure to put it into context that we're talking about all students and all students' success, regardless of what their ethnicity or gender or class or disability or whether they're homeless. We should be working, and I should be working, and my team should be working every single day to make the experiences that our Wilson School District students have the best they can possibly be. And I think with these 7 goals that have been outlined, I think that we can start to collect some data for this board to have conversations on for the future and whether or not we're hitting some of those targets that we want all of our students to meet. For me, in my 32nd year in education, it's always been about what's best for all students. And I'm going to come to work every day and work with my team to do what's best for students as you do as board members. The reality is that with some topics, there's extreme passion. I've been here, this is the start of my 5th year, and we've gone through the same process with policy development since my beginning. And it always starts with the first reading. This is the only policy that I can remember that had such heated disagreement of perspectives on the initial draft. Remember, first reading is just an initial draft of that policy. So again, my recommendation is to focus back on the 7 goals that I referred to as a starting point for this work moving forward. Because I think if I read the audience when I was talking, there were a lot of heads shaking like this. I can support that. I can support that. Well, if we can merge our differences and we can start somewhere that people can agree on, isn't that what's best for our school district? And isn't that what's best for our students? Because we take out the disagreement and we work in a way that we have positive interactions. And instead of opposition, we have cooperation and collaboration. And you know, what I'm hearing from a certain population is that we need to do a better job of communicating with you what's happening in our school organization. And we're willing to do that through a communication pathway. And we're willing to listen to your input. Please understand that individuals who have come to the microphone, we as a team have processed your comments and your concerns because they are valid. You have a perspective that we need to honor and respect, even if we don't agree with that perspective. So, Mr. Hart, my team, myself, will be ready to talk about these 7 goals. If that's the direction the board wants administration to take, all I would need would be some direction to bring those goals back to the August 16th meeting for further discussion and hopefully for consideration, and we can attach some how we're going to measure those particular goals so that the board can have that debate as well. And we can go back to the work of doing what's right and what's in the best interest of kids. And I think that we can accomplish that together. Despite our disagreement in our perspectives, I think we can come to consensus on those items.
Thank you. My question, hearing people over the past several months coming to the podium, board members speaking tonight, other nights, and just what I'm hearing, some people seem to believe we need a policy to address this issue. Some people may feel we do not need a policy to address this issue. Do we have problems? Do we not have problems? I believe in our teachers and support staff and administration. They're doing a great job to address all of these issues. That's my personal belief. I have children that have come through this district. They've all been served well. I have students that have been gifted, and I have a son who is in life skills. I've seen the range of students through my own family and my teaching and my administration. Can you please, maybe Dr. Faley, I don't mean to put you on the spot, could you and your administration, to our August 16th meeting, if the board disagrees, please tell me, make a recommendation where we should continue on the process for our second reading and third reading? Or do we stop here and what do we address? Do we give goals to the committee that's been working on this policy? Where do we go? Do we need a policy right now, or do we need to step back and say, here's our focus, this is what we want to accomplish. Maybe we do need a policy, but let's not try to solve that tonight. Let's not solve that next week. Let's come together and talk about it. So I hear multiple sides, and every side is valid. Everyone has felt different feelings in their education, their community, in their life, and I don't want to discount any of that. We've all had an issue regarding something. So let's take a step back. My recommendation, we take a step back, come with a recommendation at the next board meeting. Do we continue on with this policy at the second reading? When do we convene as a group to modify it? And then to the final reading for adoption? Or do you say, you know what, we're not going to have a policy at this time. Let's come together, common goals and common direction to address whatever that issue may be. And there are issues, and everyone is different. How can we address that issue? So Dr. Fada, if you could make a recommendation on what you think what you believe.
Well, certainly, there's a lot of debate on the wording. I'll just use the wording and some of the context within Policy 832 as it's currently written. Certainly, my team can work together under my direction to come back to the board with some specific goals for that policy. I think the 7 that I've outlined are the places to start. And remember, I want to make this point very clear. Remember that the initial policy that the board can come to consensus on may be those 7 goals, because that's what I think the work of the ad hoc committee was going to be for this year moving forward. But policies have an opportunity and have changed and been added to over time. I mean, we come back with revisions to policies all the time at the direction of PSBA and sometimes at the direction of the board. So I think we need a starting point to begin this work. I think the work disconnected from some of the conversation about critical race theory. I don't think that's what we're asking the work to be. We're asking the work to be specifically focused on what's best for all kids, and we've outlined 7 very detailed goals that will begin that work. So certainly we'll work on that and bring it back on the 16th in a form that we can have discussion as a second reading, if that's the board's direction.
Thank you. And as we work through that process, ultimately we'll hit a second reading and a third reading for adoption. At that time, there can still be debate and discussion. Do we adopt it or do we not? So just thank you, Dr. Faley. Thank you, board members. Thank you, committee members, administration, staff.
May I make one more comment?
You may.
I also want to make sure that as we work through this process, we give the individuals that have asked for the opportunity to have additional information in a public environment where they can ask questions of administration, the opportunity to do so. So my team and I will make ourselves available, and we will schedule some time for there to be a discussion. Public comment is not an opportunity for a debate back and forth with the public, but I want to make sure that we're hearing and answering the questions that are coming to us from the community, whichever side wants to ask those questions, whatever the belief statements are as individuals in our community. I believe that's my responsibility and my team's responsibility to make ourselves available, and we will do that, and we will get that scheduled soon. And we will communicate out. I know the individuals that can spread the word in this room, and we'll send it out to our entire community as well to gauge the level of interest on some of the goals that we've talked about.
Thank you. Okay, under committees, Berks Career and Technology Center, Mrs. Casper. Equity Committee, Mrs. Casper.
I have no report.
Berks County IU, Dr. Kennedy.
I have no report. The IU is meeting again in August.
Curriculum Council.
Curriculum Committee will not meet until September. We haven't met all summer, and we won't meet until September.
Extracurricular, Mrs. Cocker.
Extracurricular Committee is next Monday at noon. Other than that, I have no report.
Facilities, Mr. Negrini.
Next meeting is next Monday at 4:30 here in this room.
Finance, Mr. Martin.
No report.
Legislative, Mr. Martin.
Well, you know everybody's on vacation until September, but Amy probably knows this already, but the state higher education approved to combine 6 universities into 2, and there will be Bloomsburg, Lock Haven, and Mansfield, California University of Pennsylvania, Edinburgh, and Clareton. All schools will remain open, but under one direction.
Sports, this move will not save any money, and they have no plan how faculty is going to go back and forth. Some of these universities are 3 hours away from each other, and the faculty will be the same faculty for all of the universities, and I'm just not sure how that's going to work, and I thank God it's not Kutztown. It's a bad idea.
There's smarter people than you and I out there making those decisions.
Yeah, smarter.
That's it.
Human Resources, no report. Public Relations, Mrs. Troutman. Okay, she will have her own report when she gets back then. Education Foundation, Mr. Case.
No report.
Technology Committee, Mr. Schneider.
We were supposed to meet today, but our meeting was canceled. The one really big piece is, just like in every other industry, some of the technology that was ordered for this year is backlogged. So when it gets here, we'll get it distributed to the proper parties.
Thank you. I don't believe we have any public participation on non-agenda items. Okay. Okay. Mrs. Cocker? We'll accept it. Read his name.
Yeah. So this board would push through policies fast. So I stood here March of 2020. I challenged this board to adopt a curriculum that blends with VOTEC and a path that does not put children who are in vocational studies on the path to college prep and admission. Does this board remember that? It could be a simple nod, because many of you met with me out here, out there, and said, this is not what we want to do. You specifically.
Where were you when the math curriculum came through, when we had a path for those kids?
Oh, we're doing debate now?
No, we're not doing debate. We will hear you through, sir.
Thank you. I'd love to.
Not tonight,
So,
thank you.
You know, we're talking about moving all this stuff through, but where's the discussion for that? You know, where's the equity for students who are facing a school year where they may go 7 days without education? But if the career centers close, they might go 14. Because that's the path for them. Carpentry like my son, auto mechanics, electrical, cosmetology, graphic design. I can't believe that in the August meeting, Ms. Casper, you don't have a report. How can you not have a report?
Sir, we're not supposed to direct individual board members, please. Please.
Well,
speak
it's
to the whole
specific
board.
to the curriculum discussion.
Let's address it to the board, please. Thank you.
So I'm not sure how we can go from March of 2020 to now and have nothing, and we're going into September. I've communicated with the board. I don't get replies. I get one reply, we're with you. I send back, I get nothing. This community is immensely frustrated, not just on equity, not just on CRT, but as a whole with this board, because we feel you no longer represent the best interests of this community. And that's the truth. And we'll be bringing that to light in the upcoming months, and you'll see in a fair way. You'll see more of me, more of others. But I cannot believe I've sat here and listened to equity, and in that same time frame, we're coming up on nearly 18 months. The equity of Career Center students as it blends to COVID impacting their schedule. 60% of their schedule last year was off the calendar immediately. And then if there was days they were closed, they got nothing. There were times in a 3-4 week period, my son went to school to Career Center twice, 3 times. That's it. That's it. I've told one of the members that if this school reverts into virtual learning and my son reverts back into the mental issues that he had, borderline suicidal, I will pull him in his 12th year. Because for his trade, he needs competency, not a certificate. And that's what the world rewards.
Thank you, sir.
Our district needs to teach competency.
Sir, Dr. Fadley would gladly meet with you if you'd like to talk to Mrs. Carroll afterwards. She'll make an appointment for the two of you to talk.
The last time I'll take an open invite. If I get stood up again, no more. I'll happily meet you, but I will not be stood up again for 18 months.
Would you meet Mrs. Carroll afterwards? Actually, we have, and let her know.
Schedule something before you leave tonight.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Looking for motion to adjourn? Mr. Martin first, we have a second.
Second case.
Mr. Case, thank you, everyone.